The message came in at 12:45 a.m., a faint buzz against the deafening quiet of my room. I stared at it, heart thumping, caught between curiosity and hesitation. It was her, my Tinder match. "What are you doing right now?" I hesitated, glancing at the clock. It was late, but her follow-up came quickly. "Come out with me." For a moment, I thought about saying no. It was cold outside, and the last time I let my guard down, it had cost me 3 years of my life and left me in pieces. But then, the voice in my head reminded me, "You're single now. Take the chance. Live a little." "I'll pick you up," she added. That sealed it. My heart raced as I threw on my best shirt, splashed on cologne, and checked myself in the mirror one last time. Confidence wasn't my strong suit these days, but tonight felt like it could be the start of something new, or at least a distraction. The car pulled up a few minutes later, headlights cutting through the stillness of the street. I stepped out, half nervous, half excited. But when I opened the car door, my stomach dropped. She wasn't alone. My match sat in the passenger seat, flashing a quick smile, but behind the wheel was another woman, a friend apparently. I hesitated for a second before sliding into the back seat. Weird, but maybe they were just cautious. Women had their reasons for traveling in pairs, I guessed. "Which club are we heading to?" I asked, trying to mask my unease. "We're not going out," my match said, twisting to look at me, her voice airy and nonchalant. "Just out." I frowned. "Where exactly?" "Just into town," she said, offering no further detail. The conversation fell flat after that. The car ride was awkward, filled with random chatter between them that excluded me almost entirely. My gut tightened with every mile. Something was off, but I wasn't sure what. Soon, we pulled into an empty car park under a bridge, the space dimly lit and eerily quiet. The driver killed the engine, leaned back, and pulled out a 1-liter bottle of chocolate milk. My match seemed unfazed, laughing along as her friend drank straight from the oversized container like it was a bottle of champagne. They turned the radio up, rolled cigarettes, and started chatting about the most mind-numbing nonsense, stuff I couldn't even pretend to care about. Minutes dragged on like hours. I kept glancing at my phone, wondering if this was some kind of test or cruel joke. After 15 minutes, they got out of the car to smoke. I followed, the frigid air hitting me like a slap. And that's when I saw it, my match stepping out in fluffy white slippers that lit up with every step. I stared, blinking, unsure if I was seeing things. She shuffled around the gravel, her glowing feet an absurd sight against the grim backdrop of the bridge. The unease boiled over into irritation. What was I even doing here? I'd agreed to step outside my comfort zone, but this was something else entirely. I turned to face them, hands shoved deep in my pockets. "Look," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I appreciate you picking me up, but this really isn't my scene. I think I'm going to head off. Have a good night." Their faces froze, the surprise quickly morphing into offense. "Seriously?" My match scoffed, the light from her slippers flickering as she shifted her weight. The driver muttered something under her breath, shaking her head. I didn't care. I walked away, my breath fogging in the cold night air, each step lighter than the last. The discomfort, the awkward silence, the glowing slippers, it all felt like the universe's way of reminding me I deserved better. That night wasn't the start of something new, but it was the end of pretending to settle for anything less than what I truly wanted. Sometimes taking a chance means walking away. The restaurant buzzed with the warm chatter of other diners, their voices blending with the clinking of silverware and the soft hum of background music. I sat stiffly at the table, trying to steady my nerves. It had been a long time since I'd been on a date. Too long, thanks to the emotional wreckage of a 3-year relationship that had ended in flames. But here I was, determined to try again, pushing myself to embrace the terrifying world of dating. For 2 weeks, I'd been talking to this guy. On paper, he seemed great, funny, charming, and no glaring red flags. Our conversations had been light, easy, the kind that made me think maybe, just maybe, I was ready to move on. When he asked me out to dinner, I said yes, hoping this was the first step toward something good. He arrived a little late, all smiles and confidence as he slid into the booth across from me. The dim lighting cast soft shadows over his face, making him seem almost too perfect. "Sorry I'm late," he said, brushing off the apology with a wink. Traffic was a nightmare. I smiled politely, nerves still fluttering in my chest. The waitress appeared quickly, handing us menus and taking our drink orders. I ordered a soda, eager to keep my head clear, and he ordered some craft beer that he clearly thought was impressive. We started chatting, the kind of awkward small talk that felt like trudging through knee-deep mud, but I figured that was normal for a first date. Then, somewhere in the middle of explaining why I hadn't been out much lately, I said, "I've been saving up for a washer and dryer. Mine broke a while ago, and I've been trying to budget for replacements." He leaned back in his chair, smirking like he knew something I didn't. "You know," he said, his voice casual but laced with something sharp, "instead of saving for that, you should save for a boob job." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. My brain froze, the words hanging in the air between us like a bad joke waiting for a punchline. But the punchline never came. He was dead serious. I stared at him, stunned into silence. My stomach churned, and my cheeks flushed with embarrassment and anger. Before I could even figure out how to respond, he doubled down. No, it's not a bad thing," he said, waving a hand as if he was doing me a favor. "My sister and mom both had small tits, and they got boob jobs. They look amazing now." I blinked, my mind reeling. Did he really just say that? To me? On a first date? Before we even had our drinks? My throat tightened, a lump of indignation forming as I tried to comprehend the sheer audacity. He just sat there, looking at me like he'd offered sage advice, like he expected me to thank him for his thoughtful suggestion. I glanced around the restaurant, suddenly hyper-aware of every other table. Couples laughed, groups clinked glasses, and servers wove between tables, oblivious to the humiliation burning through me. My heart raced, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't say a word. I didn't argue or demand an explanation. I just stood up, grabbed my bag, and walked out. My chair scraped loudly against the floor, drawing a few curious glances from nearby diners, but I didn't care. Let them stare. Let him sit there and wonder what he'd done wrong. The cold night air hit me like a slap, a welcome contrast to the suffocating heat of the restaurant. I kept walking, my heels clicking against the pavement, adrenaline surging through my veins. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, the part that had been worn down by heartbreak and self-doubt. By the time I reached my car, the initial shock had faded, replaced by a simmering anger. How dare he? How dare anyone think they could comment on my body like that, as if it was their right to decide what I should or shouldn't change. I sat in my car for a long moment, staring at the steering wheel, letting the weight of what had just happened sink in. The absurdity of it all hit me then, and I laughed, sharp and bitter, but a laugh nonetheless. This wasn't the start of a love story, but maybe it was the start of something better. A reminder that I didn't have to settle, didn't have to endure thoughtless comments or gross entitlement just to feel wanted. A notification from Tinder. I checked it, my pulse quickening out of habit. A match had messaged me. Her profile had caught my eye earlier, sharp wit in her bio, a mischievous glint in her photos. I'd been hopeful. "Hey, what's up?" I typed back, keeping it simple, not wanting to overthink it. Her response came almost immediately, but it wasn't anything I could have anticipated. "Don't talk to me unless you plan on. Well, unless you meet certain standards." I froze, rereading the message. The tone wasn't playful or flirtatious. It was brash, over the top, and left no room for conversation. I sat there, unsure whether to laugh or roll my eyes. I replied with something. What? I can't even remember now. But whatever it was, it didn't matter. She didn't respond, and I let it go, chalking it up to one of those bizarre online interactions everyone warns you about. A week passed, and the strange encounter faded from my mind. Life went on as usual, classes, work, and the occasional late-night fast food run. That night, my stomach growled after hours of cramming for an exam, so I decided to grab something quick. McDonald's seemed like the easiest option. The place was buzzing with its usual hum of activity, the fluorescent lights casting an odd glow over everything. I stepped into the line, placed my order, and shuffled to the counter to wait. My thoughts drifted, half focused on a class project due next week, when the employee behind the counter called my number. I stepped forward, not thinking much of it, but the moment she handed me my bag, the air shifted. Our eyes met, and time seemed to freeze. It was her, the girl from Tinder. Recognition flickered in her eyes first, and it was instant. Her expression shifted rapidly, a flash of disbelief followed by something closer to fear. She looked at me like I was the villain in some terrible drama, her hands visibly trembling as she held out my bag of food. For a split second, I was too stunned to react. Then the realization hit me like a wave. She thought I'd come here intentionally, that I'd tracked her down to confront her over that ridiculous message. The awkwardness in the air was suffocating, an invisible wall of tension that seemed to grow thicker with every passing second. I wanted to say something, to clear up the misunderstanding, but my brain refused to cooperate. What could I possibly say? Hey, I didn't know you worked here, and this is purely a coincidence. That sounded almost worse, like an excuse someone would give when caught red-handed. Her eyes darted to the door, then back to me, as if gauging the fastest escape route. I could feel the weight of her co-workers' curious glances, though none of them seemed to realize what was happening. My face burned with embarrassment. This wasn't just awkward, it was surreal. Finally, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the bag, muttered a quick, "Thanks," and walked out as fast as my legs would carry me. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing with every step. I didn't look back, didn't dare risk seeing her reaction again. The cool night air hit me like a bomb as I stepped outside, but the tension in my chest didn't ease until I was halfway to my car. Sitting behind the wheel, I let out a shaky breath and shook my head, replaying the scene in my mind. What were the odds of something like this happening? It felt like the universe had decided to turn my life into some twisted comedy sketch. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the image of her face, wide-eyed, pale, filled with fear. She probably thought I was some kind of stalker, and the thought made me cringe. In reality, I barely remembered the interaction until now. The whole thing had been ridiculous from start to finish. A bizarre encounter that I wouldn't have believed if it hadn't happened to me. The next day, I deleted Tinder. Maybe I'd try again someday, but for now, I'd had enough of awkward dates and strange online encounters. Some lessons, I realized, don't need repeating. The theater was buzzing with excitement that night, the kind of electric energy that only comes from the premiere of a blockbuster movie. I'd been looking forward to this for weeks, a first date with someone who seemed genuinely interesting. Star Wars, The Force Awakens was the film, a perfect excuse for shared popcorn and whispered commentary during the action-packed scenes. At least, that's how I'd imagined it. What I didn't imagine was the surprise waiting for me when I arrived. She was standing by the ticket counter, but she wasn't alone. Beside her was another girl, grinning awkwardly. "This is my sister," my date said casually, as though it was the most natural thing in the world to bring a chaperone to a first date. I blinked, unsure how to respond. My gut told me something was off, but I shrugged it off. Maybe they were close, maybe it was last minute. Play it cool, I told myself. What's the worst that could happen? The worst started with the tickets. Somehow, I ended up pulling out my wallet and paying for all three of us. I can't even recall how it happened. It just did. Maybe it was her charm, or maybe it was the fact that old me couldn't handle confrontation. Either way, I found myself standing in line with a sinking feeling, clutching tickets for a movie I suddenly wasn't excited about anymore. As we settled into our seats, the situation only got worse. The lights dimmed, the iconic Star Wars crawl began, and I glanced over at them, eager to share in the moment. But they both looked utterly lost. "So who's that guy?" her sister whispered loudly, pointing at the screen. "Wait, what's the deal with the gold robot?" my date chimed in. It hit me then. They had never seen a Star Wars movie before. Not one. I stared ahead, trying to suppress my frustration as they whispered back and forth, their confusion breaking any chance of getting lost in the movie. Every twist, every reveal, every callback to the originals, none of it landed for them. Meanwhile, I sat there, acutely aware of how much I'd been looking forward to this moment, and how completely derailed it had become. When the credits finally rolled, I sighed in relief, ready to head home and call it a night. But no, the evening wasn't over yet. They wanted McDonald's. We piled into the fast food joint, the smell of fries and grease filling the air. I grabbed something small, a drink maybe, and watched as my date ordered fries. Just fries. Her sister ordered a full meal, of course. They sat across from me, chatting away like I wasn't even there. For over an hour, I sat in that fluorescent-lit purgatory, nursing my drink and watching her eat fries one at a time. Meanwhile, her sister took center stage, launching into an unfiltered tirade about everyone at her job. Co-workers, managers, even customers. No one was safe from her sharp, biting commentary. Every time I tried to shift the conversation, to steer it towards something even remotely date-like, she'd interrupt, dragging the focus back to her ongoing workplace drama. I glanced at my date more than once, hoping for some sign of acknowledgement, some spark of connection that might salvage the night. But she seemed content to let her sister dominate the conversation, occasionally nodding along or throwing in the odd comment. By the time I finally made it to my car, my head was spinning. What had just happened? Was this a date? A family outing? Some kind of elaborate prank? The whole experience felt surreal, like I'd stumbled into someone else's bizarre evening and been forced to play along. There was no second date, not even an attempt. She didn't reach out, and neither did I. To this day, I still think about that night from time to time, trying to make sense of it. Was it a test? A joke? Or just a glaring incompatibility that became painfully obvious over a tray of cold fries? I may not have gotten answers, but I walked away with one valuable lesson. If someone brings an unexpected guest to a first date, it's a red flag the size of a Star Destroyer. And next time, I'd be paying for only one ticket, mine. The air felt heavier than usual as I walked up the driveway, my heart pounding with the familiar mix of excitement and nervousness that comes with a first-time hookup. It had been a while since I'd let myself be this vulnerable, and I'd convinced myself this was going to be fun, casual, and maybe a bit thrilling. He'd seemed charming, funny even, and his messages hinted at a night I wouldn't regret. His place was small and a bit cluttered, but I didn't think much of it. We wasted no time, and before I knew it, we were tangled in a moment that was somehow both electric and slightly awkward. First-time encounters often are. Afterward, we lay there, the room falling into a quiet that felt too still. And that's when it happened. "So," he said, propping himself up on one elbow, his voice carrying a strange undertone I couldn't quite place. "You want to know what I'm really into?" I blinked, caught off guard. I forced a laugh, trying to keep the mood light. Sure. Why not?" Without warning, he reached down and grabbed my foot. My heart slammed against my ribs, and panic shot through me like ice water. I have an irrational fear, noophobia, of people touching my feet. It's the kind of thing that makes me freeze up or bolt, and in that moment, I chose the latter. I yanked my foot away, practically leaping off the bed. "I've got to go," I muttered, my voice trembling as I scrambled to find my clothes. My hands fumbled, but my legs moved instinctively, propelling me toward the exit before I could process what had just happened. I burst out of his room and into the dimly lit hallway, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My only focus was the door, the way out, the promise of fresh air that didn't feel suffocating. As I moved through the house, I noticed details I hadn't before: family photos lining the walls, mismatched furniture that spoke of years of use. I hadn't realized I wasn't in his place at all. I was in his parents' house. The living room came into view, and I nearly froze. Sitting on the couch, with a steaming cup of tea balanced on her knee, was a woman I knew well. Too well. It was my old therapist. Her eyes met mine, widening in shock, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. 100 memories flooded back, sessions spent unpacking my insecurities, her calm voice guiding me through emotional storms, the small but meaningful breakthroughs. And now, here I was, half-dressed and stumbling out of her son's bedroom. She looked at me, her expression a blend of disbelief and something that might have been concern. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but no words came. What could I even say? "Sorry, I didn't know this was your house. Also, I might have traumatized your son by running out of his room like it was on fire." Her son's voice broke the silence, calling from the hallway behind me. "Hey, you okay? Did I freak you out?" I didn't turn around. I couldn't. All I could do was nod stiffly at her, mutter something unintelligible under my breath, and make a beeline for the front door. My feet hit the pavement outside, the cool night air rushing over me like a slap. I didn't stop until I was a block away, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. It wasn't until I was safely back in my car, the engine humming softly, that the absurdity of the situation hit me. I leaned back in the seat, staring at the ceiling, and let out a laugh, hollow and disbelieving at first, then louder, uncontrollable. It was the kind of laugh that comes when there's nothing else you can do. I drove home in a daze, the events replaying in my mind like some surreal, dark comedy. The night had started with what I thought would be a simple hookup, a chance to step outside of my routine, and ended with me running out of a stranger's room, into the living room of my former therapist. Needless to say, there wasn't a second date. The dim glow of my phone's screen lit up my dorm room as I scrolled through Tinder late one night, bored out of my mind and half-heartedly swiping. It was a typical college evening, homework pushed to the side, social life creeping into the foreground. Then I saw her. She was older than me by a year or two, a junior or senior at the same university, with a smile that radiated confidence and an energy that felt magnetic even through her profile photos. A match came almost immediately, followed by her first message. Fast forward a few days, and I was at her apartment for our first hangout. The vibe was relaxed, nothing too intense, just Netflix and casual conversation. I thought she was amazing, down to earth, funny, and way out of my league. As I left that night, I found myself hoping this could turn into something real. When I told her I'd like to see her again, her reply was enthusiastic. "I'd love that. Just hit me up whenever." The week that followed was a flurry of texts and Snapchats. It felt exciting, like the kind of connection you don't stumble upon often. Then, out of the blue, she sent me a nude. I was startled, not because I didn't find her attractive, she was stunning, but because it was so unexpected. We hadn't crossed any lines during our first hangout. It had been completely platonic. Yet here she was, sending me pictures that left no room for ambiguity. I was a young guy, and this confident older girl was showing me attention I hadn't even asked for. I won't lie, I was flattered. And of course, I didn't object. The messages escalated over the week, and by the time we planned to meet again, I had no doubt where things were heading. That Saturday, she came over to my place. My roommates and I were lounging in the living room watching TV, and she seamlessly fit into the dynamic, laughing and chatting like she'd been part of the group for years. At one point, she leaned over and asked if she could stay the night. My brain went into overdrive. After everything she'd been sending me all week, I knew what she meant. Trying to be polite, I offered to sleep on the couch, but she shot that down quickly. "I'd rather you sleep in your bed with me," she said, her voice soft but firm. It was clear, this was happening. We retreated to my room, and one thing led to another. We hooked up, and afterward, we lay side by side in the hazy quiet that follows, the kind where you're not sure whether to break the silence or just let it linger. I'd tossed the used condom to the floor beside the bed, not thinking much of it in the moment. Then, out of nowhere, she got up abruptly. I watched as she walked around to my side of the bed and bent down to pick up the condom. My heart sank, confusion gripping me. Without saying a word, she darted into the bathroom and shut the door. A beat passed, then another. I stayed in bed, unsure of what to do. Then I heard a loud crash, followed by her voice muttering a panicked, "Oh no." Alarmed, I called out, "Are you okay?" No response. I hesitated for a moment before walking to the bathroom door. My mind raced with possibilities. Had she slipped? Hurt herself? But nothing could have prepared me for what I saw when I opened the door. She was standing in my shower, one leg propped up, trying to shove the condom into herself. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what she was doing, flipping the condom inside out and attempting to inseminate herself. I froze, my brain struggling to process the scene unfolding in front of me. Her head snapped toward me, eyes wide with shock. Time seemed to stand still for a second, then everything sped up. I shut the door as quickly as I'd opened it, my heart pounding in my chest. A moment later, she emerged, avoiding my gaze. "I'm gonna leave," she said quickly, grabbing her things. "Sounds good," I replied, my voice hollow. There was nothing else to say. The door clicked shut behind her, and I stood there in stunned silence. My mind replayed the night over and over, searching for answers I'd never get. She never contacted me again, and I didn't reach out either. To this day, that night remains a surreal, unsettling memory, one that reminds me just how unpredictable people can be. The gamer bar was alive with the hum of arcade machines and the clatter of controllers, a place where neon lights bounced off walls plastered with pixelated murals. It was my kind of scene, nostalgic, geeky, and laid back. Tonight, it was also the setting for my first date with someone who seemed promising. We'd bonded over mutual nerdy interests and swapped witty banter through text messages, the kind of conversations that made me hopeful this might actually be different. When he walked in, he looked just like his profile photos, a little scruffy, glasses perched on his nose, and wearing a t-shirt with some obscure gaming reference that I immediately recognized. I waved, and he came over, smiling warmly. The moment he opened his mouth to greet me, however, my stomach dropped. He had no teeth. None. I struggled to mask my shock, my brain scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't something small or superficial. It was a glaring detail, one that had been carefully hidden during our chats and video calls. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. He probably had a good reason for it, right? Maybe an accident or a medical condition. I forced a smile and pushed the thought aside as we sat down. The conversation started smoothly enough. He was just as funny and smart as he'd seemed online, throwing out clever quips and sharing anecdotes about his favorite games. But soon he leaned in, lowering his voice as if he were about to share a secret. "So," he began, glancing around before continuing, "I don't know if you noticed." I blinked, trying not to look directly at his gums as he spoke. "Noticed what?" I asked, feigning ignorance. He gestured vaguely toward his face. "The teeth thing." It was impossible to ignore now. He launched into an explanation about a hack dentist who had convinced him all his teeth needed to be removed. Then came the horror story of budget constraints that prevented him from getting dentures, and the grim detail that he had to wait for bone shards to fall out of his gums before he could even consider replacements. I listened, nodding along sympathetically. It was a tragic story, and I genuinely felt bad for him. But as he spoke, it became clear that he was completely unfazed by the situation. He joked about it, brushing off any discomfort it might cause, both for himself and for me. And then the food arrived. As he talked, particles of his meal sprayed from his mouth, landing on the shared basket of fries between us. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but each fleck of food was a tiny jab at my appetite. It wasn't his fault, of course, he couldn't help it, but the visual was too much to ignore. I found myself retreating inward, my thoughts spiraling. If he'd hidden something this monumental from me, what else might he be keeping secret? Trust was the cornerstone of any relationship, and this omission felt like a crack in the foundation before we'd even started building anything. He, meanwhile, was oblivious to my growing discomfort, continuing to talk enthusiastically about his favorite games and the tabletop campaigns he'd been running. Normally, I'd have been thrilled to dive into those topics, but my focus kept shifting back to the reality of the situation. As the evening wore on, I realized something else. I couldn't get past the thought of intimacy with someone who had no teeth. I felt shallow for even thinking it, but the idea of kissing him made my stomach churn. I kept imagining the texture, the sensation, and it was enough to make me push my food away entirely. When the check came, I politely suggested we call it a night. He smiled, seemingly unaware of my internal struggle, and thanked me for such a fun time. I smiled back, hoping it didn't look forced, and we went our separate ways. On the drive home, I replayed the evening in my mind. It wasn't just the teeth, it was the way he'd hidden it, the way he assumed it wouldn't matter. Maybe it didn't to some people, but to me, it was a breach of trust one couldn't overlook. The next day, when he texted to ask about a second date, I let him down gently. He was a good guy, but I knew deep down that this wasn't something I could move past. Some things, no matter how trivial they might seem, are just too big to ignore. I had just joined Match.com, back when online dating was still a novelty and mostly populated by people desperate enough to take a chance on the unknown. I didn't have high hopes, but when her profile popped up, everything changed. She was stunning, out of my league stunning. The kind of beauty that made you double-check to see if it was some kind of catfish situation. But it wasn't. She responded to my message, and soon we were planning a date. When I met her in person, I felt like I was walking on air. She was even more gorgeous than her photos, all confidence and charm wrapped up in a perfectly tailored outfit. To my shock, the date was going well. Better than well. We were laughing, talking like we'd known each other forever, and by the time the first drinks were finished, we'd already stolen a kiss in the corner of the restaurant. I couldn't believe my luck. This kind of thing didn't happen to me. Not to me. So when she suggested we keep the night going and head to a bar nearby, I didn't hesitate. If anything, I was eager to stretch out the magic as long as possible. The bar was dimly lit, cozy, with a warm hum of conversation filling the air. We found a quiet corner, tucked away from the crowd, and settled in with our drinks. She leaned in close, her hand brushing mine, her laugh lighting up the room. I couldn't stop marveling at the surreal turn my night had taken. And then the door opened. A group of young African men walked in, laughing and talking among themselves. It was unusual, I'll admit. Our town was small and predominantly white, the kind of place where seeing people of different ethnicities stood out more than it should have. But it was no big deal, or at least it shouldn't have been. That's when she stood up. At first, I thought maybe she was going to the restroom or getting another drink. But instead, she turned toward the group and began shouting. Loudly. "You don't belong here," she yelled, her voice cutting through the chatter in the bar like a knife. "Go back to where you came from." The words hit me like a freight train, and the air seemed to leave the room. She wasn't done. She kept going, dropping slurs, including that word, over and over. The group of men froze, exchanging incredulous looks, their laughter replaced with stunned silence. The entire bar turned to watch the scene unfold, a mixture of disbelief and unease rippling through the crowd. It felt like a scene from a horror movie, the kind where the camera zooms in on the protagonist's horrified face while the world around them spins into chaos. My mind raced, every cell in my body screaming, "What is happening right now?" I stared at her, my chest tightening with a sickening realization. This person, this gorgeous, seemingly perfect person, was nothing like the woman I thought I'd spent the evening with. My skin crawled as the shock melted into shame, embarrassment, and anger. I couldn't sit there a second longer. I stood up, grabbed my coat, and walked straight out the door without looking back. The cold night air hit my face as I stepped outside, but it did little to cool the fire of emotions raging inside me. She didn't follow me. At least, not immediately. The next day, my phone buzzed with a message from her. She wanted to meet up again. Another date. Like nothing had happened. I didn't reply. There was no explanation she could offer, no excuse I could stomach. Some things you just can't unsee, and her actions were one of them. Too good to be true. That's what the whole night had been. A cruel, twisted reminder that appearances don't mean a thing when the person behind them is rotten to the core. For days, I replayed the night in my head, wondering how I could have missed the signs, if there even were any. But the truth was, I hadn't missed anything. She'd hidden it well, the way people often do with their worst traits, until the right moment brought it to the surface. She'd seemed like a great match on Tinder. Smart, edgy, with a sense of humor that bordered on irreverent but never crossed into outright bizarre. At least, that's what I thought. She walked in, dressed to impress, exuding confidence. I stood up to greet her, trying to hide my nervous energy. From the outset, she seemed exactly as I'd imagined. Funny, engaging, and full of sharp wit. Over appetizers, we talked about everything from school to movies to our shared love of obscure music. It felt easy, natural, until it didn't. The shift came gradually, subtle at first. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone, and asked if I'd ever had a truly wild relationship. I laughed awkwardly, unsure of what she meant, and said something vague about not being the adventurous type. That's when the conversation took a turn I hadn't seen coming. "You know," she began, stirring her drink absently, "I've been thinking a lot about my ex-husband lately." The mention of an ex wasn't unusual. Everyone has a past, but the way she said it made my skin prickle. "Oh," I said cautiously, unsure of where this was going. She smiled, a strange glint in her eye. "I was thinking, if we hook up tonight, maybe we could record it, for fun. And then I could send it to him." The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. I froze, unsure if I'd misheard her. "You'd send it to your ex?" I asked, my voice faltering. "Yeah," she said, completely nonchalant. "He'd lose his mind. It'd be hilarious." I forced a laugh, trying to mask my discomfort, but my mind was already spinning. This wasn't just a red flag, it was an entire parade of them. I reached for my water, stalling for time, trying to decide if I should cut the date short right then and there. But before I could think of an excuse to leave, she took the conversation to an even darker place. "You know what I really enjoy?" she asked, her tone suddenly serious. I looked up, hesitant to answer. "What's that?" "I like being hit," she said matter-of-factly, as if she were discussing a favorite hobby. "And my favorite kind of sex is safe word rape." I didn't even know how to respond. My brain stalled, caught between disbelief and an overwhelming urge to get as far away as possible. She smiled as if she'd just shared a fun little secret, completely oblivious to the wave of unease washing over me. I set my fork down, my appetite gone. Every alarm bell in my head was screaming at full volume. This wasn't a casual quirk or a harmless eccentricity. This was something far darker, something I couldn't begin to untangle. I don't think I'm really your type," I managed to say, my voice shaking slightly. "Maybe we should call it a night." Her expression barely faltered. She shrugged, as if she'd expected this reaction, and went back to sipping her drink. "Suit yourself," she said, completely unfazed. I signaled for the check, paid for the meal without looking at her, and left the restaurant as quickly as I could without outright sprinting. The cool night air hit me like a wave, but it did little to calm my racing heart. I walked back to my car in a daze, replaying the conversation in my mind, each word more surreal than the last. When I got home, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my phone. Tinder was still open, her profile staring back at me, a stark reminder of how far off the rails things had gone. Without hesitation, I deleted the app, erasing it from my phone like I was scrubbing away the memory of the night. That date wasn't just a bad experience, it was a wake-up call. I'd gone looking for connection, something light and fun to break the monotony of college life. Instead, I'd found a dark corner of the dating world I hadn't been prepared for. Some people's stories aren't meant to intertwine, and hers was one I was more than happy to leave behind. The first time my mom told me she was joining Tinder, I nearly spit out my coffee. It wasn't that I was against it. In fact, I was all for her stepping into a new chapter after enduring decades of an unhappy marriage. It was just unexpected. Stella's getting her groove back, she declared with a smirk, echoing the title of that old movie. And I, as her adult child, was 100% on her team. If anyone deserved a little adventure, it was her. From the start, she made it clear, this wasn't about finding a long-term relationship. No romance, no strings, just a bit of fun while she was on a work trip out of state. It sounded harmless enough. She started sending me screenshots of potential matches, asking for my opinions. It was surreal, sitting in my tiny college apartment, playing wingman to my own mom. Not this guy, I'd text back. His bio screams midlife crisis. Or, swipe left. He's holding a fish. You hate fishing. And then she found him. The guy. Her pick for the night. The moment I saw his profile, alarm bells went off. His photos were normal enough, but his bio read like a walking, talking red flag. He seemed too smooth, too eager. The kind of guy who could charm anyone into letting their guard down. Mom, I texted, this guy is sketchy. Hard pass. But she laughed it off. Oh, come on. He's just cute and chatty. What's the worst that could happen? She was an adult. I couldn't stop her. So, with some last-minute safety reminders from me, share your location. Tell me when you're back at the hotel. She went off to meet him. The next morning, I got the text. Well, that was interesting. She didn't elaborate, just said they'd hung out for a few hours, and he'd dropped her off. Nothing serious, she added, which I took as her way of saying it was over. Or so I thought. Later that afternoon, she called me, her voice shaking. He knows my address. I froze. What? How? Apparently, during their brief time together, he'd pieced together enough details about her life, her work, the city she'd flown from, and the general timeline of her trip, to figure out which flight she was taking the next day. From there, he'd tracked down her final destination. Using public tax records, he'd found her full name, which led him to her Facebook profile. It didn't stop there. He called your dad, she whispered, her voice barely audible. My stomach dropped. My parents hadn't spoken directly since the divorce. For this stranger to insert himself into their lives, calling my dad and spilling details about my mom's Tinder rendezvous, was beyond invasive. My mom sounded utterly rattled as she recounted the messages he'd sent her afterward, swinging wildly between professions of love and accusations of betrayal. He sent him pictures, she continued, and screenshots of our texts. Everything. I was furious, both for her and for myself. This wasn't just about my mom anymore. This man had disrupted our family in the most grotesque way possible. You need to call the police, I told her. She hesitated, not wanting to escalate things, but I insisted. This wasn't something to brush off. The harassment didn't stop. Over the next few days, he sent her a barrage of messages, alternating between declaring undying love and berating her for being untrustworthy. He demanded explanations, claiming he couldn't trust her even though she'd done nothing wrong. My mom blocked him on everything, Tinder, Facebook, her phone, but he found ways around it, creating new accounts to send her messages. Eventually, she did go to the police. They took her seriously, thankfully, and started the process of filing a restraining order. But the experience left her shaken to her core. For weeks, she couldn't relax, constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering if he'd show up unannounced. When the dust finally settled, she deleted Tinder and vowed never to touch dating apps again. For me, the whole ordeal was a sobering reminder of how quickly something harmless can spiral into something dangerous. I'd supported her decision to put herself out there, and I still do, but none of us could have predicted how unhinged someone could become after just a few hours of interaction. My nerves were doing their usual predate dance at the bar, but the moment he walked in, my doubts evaporated. He was tall, effortlessly handsome, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that made heads turn. He spotted me immediately, flashing a smile that could have melted glaciers, and I thought, wow, this is actually happening. The conversation flowed like water. He was charming, witty, and somehow made me feel like the most interesting person in the room. I kept catching myself thinking, how is this guy single? Better yet, why is he interested in me? It felt too good to be true, and I started wondering if maybe, just this once, I'd lucked out. The drinks turned into more drinks, and before long, the chemistry between us had us heading back to his place. His apartment was clean and well decorated, the kind of place that suggested he had his life together. I was impressed, and as he pulled me into a kiss, I thought, this night might just be perfect. Things escalated quickly. We were making out, his hands roaming, my heart pounding in anticipation. The heat between us was palpable. As we moved to his bedroom, my excitement grew. He seemed like the full package, funny, charming, and now passionate. Then came the moment I hadn't anticipated. As I pulled his pants down, I was met with surprise. There, staring back at me, was something I hadn't mentally prepared for, a micro-penis. It was maybe 2 inches long, barely the size of my finger. For a second, I froze, unsure how to react. I wasn't one to judge. Everyone's body is different, but I couldn't deny the jolt of confusion that ran through me. Okay, I told myself, let's see where this goes. I started to gently touch him, my mind racing. How are we going to have sex? I wondered. Then optimistically I thought maybe he's got other skills. Maybe he's a master at oral, and this is going to be one of those surprising, unforgettable nights. But nope. As I began to pivot the moment towards something else, he stopped me, clearly uninterested in anything except the main event. I'm not really into that, he said, brushing off the idea of foreplay with a confidence I didn't quite understand. He wanted to skip everything and go straight to penetration. I nodded, still trying to salvage the night, but doubts were beginning to creep in. He guided me to lie on my stomach and positioned himself behind me. The room was quiet except for the sound of his breathing as he began. But almost immediately, it was clear something wasn't quite right. I could feel him moving, thrusting with enthusiasm, but there was no actual penetration happening. Instead, he was sliding between my thighs. I froze, trying to figure out what to do. Should I say something? Correct him? But before I could decide, he began to talk. You like that? He asked, his voice low. My lips twitched, and I bit down hard to stifle the laugh bubbling in my throat. The absurdity of the situation was almost too much. He kept going, his dirty talk growing more explicit and confident. Meanwhile, I lay there, torn between disbelief and an overwhelming urge to laugh at the sheer absurdity of the scene. It didn't take long for him to finish, grunting with satisfaction as he collapsed beside me. I stared at the ceiling, my mind blank, trying to process what had just happened. He looked so pleased with himself, completely oblivious to the fact that he hadn't actually penetrated me at all. After a few moments of awkward silence, I mumbled something about needing to go home. He didn't protest, just smiled lazily and said he'd love to see me again. I smiled back weakly, grabbed my things, and left as quickly as I could without making it obvious. The walk back to my car was surreal. My mind replayed the events over and over, each detail more ridiculous than the last. I couldn't help but laugh once I was safely inside the car, the kind of laugh that comes from pure disbelief. That night taught me something about the unpredictable nature of dating. Sometimes, the most promising starts can lead to the strangest endings. But hey, at least it's a story. The sushi restaurant was packed, the kind of night that felt like a blur of clattering dishes, endless orders, and barely contained chaos. I darted between tables, balancing trays of sashimi and miso soup, trying to keep up with the relentless dinner rush. Among the sea of customers, one table stood out, 2 guys, one of them particularly striking. He had a confident, easy smile and tattoos that crept out from under his sleeves, hinting at stories I'd never hear. Despite the chaos, I made sure they had great service. At the end of their meal, they left a tip so generous it stopped me in my tracks. Later that night, after finally collapsing on my couch, beer in hand, I opened Tinder to mindlessly swipe and decompress. And there he was, the same guy from the restaurant, unmistakable with his sharp features and distinctive ink. My heart skipped a beat. The tip had been memorable, but this? What were the odds? I swiped right and passed out, too tired to overthink it. The next morning, I woke up to a match and a sweet message waiting for me. We started texting, and he was charming, almost disarmingly so. He mentioned he was only in town for business, which should have been my first red flag. But I was intrigued, and he asked me out to dinner at a high-end French restaurant that I could never afford on my own. I hesitated, unsure if I should go. My roommates, fueled by mimosas and bad advice, encouraged me. What's the harm in a nice dinner? They said. By that evening, I'd agreed, but things were already off. He insisted on picking me up, pressing harder than anyone should for a first date. My instincts flared, and I told him flat out that I'd cancel if I couldn't drive myself. He backed off, and we arranged to meet at the restaurant. The place was stunning, the kind of place where the lighting is dim, the wine list is longer than a novel, and everyone speaks in hushed tones. He was already seated when I arrived, looking sharp and relaxed. The dinner started well enough. He ordered a $200 bottle of wine, lobster, appetizers, and desserts, sparing no expense. By the time the bill came, I was sure the meal had totaled somewhere close to $600. I couldn't believe someone would spend that kind of money on a first date. As the evening went on, though, the facade started to crack. The more he drank, the more he let slip. Midway through the meal, he casually admitted he was married, but claimed it was an open relationship. I raised an eyebrow, skeptical. In response, he pulled out his phone, called his wife, and even sent her a picture of me. To my shock, she sounded excited. "She's gorgeous," I heard her say, her voice tinny over the speaker. "Invite her to Cancun. We'd love to meet her." My stomach churned. He hung up, grinning, and explained that his wife was bisexual and into women. He suggested I join them for a weekend getaway. Red flags piled up faster than I could process. I tried to steer the conversation to safer ground, asking about his work. Without blinking, he told me he was involved with a drug cartel. He spoke about it casually, as if it were just another day at the office. He assured me it was perfectly safe, but my chest tightened. This wasn't the kind of conversation you had on a casual date, or ever. I told him I needed to leave. He followed me out, trailing me to my car, still trying to sell me on the idea of joining him and his wife. He pulled up photos of her on his phone. She was undeniably beautiful, and scrolled through his Instagram, showing off their lavish life in Cancun. "You can trust me," he insisted. "This could be fun." When I still refused, his tone shifted. "I spent all this money on dinner," he said, his voice hardening. "The least you could do is come back to my hotel room." When I backed away, he tried to grab my hand, leaning in for a kiss I wanted no part of. My pulse was pounding as I twisted free and bolted to my car. Once inside, I locked the doors and sped away, checking the rearview mirror constantly. I was terrified he'd follow me home, so I drove aimlessly for an hour before calling a friend. I spent the night at her place, grateful she had male roommates who could make me feel safe. The next morning, I deleted Tinder without hesitation. The more I replayed the night, the darker it felt. Was he just an unhinged rich guy? Or was there something more sinister? Human trafficking, perhaps? I'll never know for sure, but I'm haunted by the thought of what could have happened if I hadn't trusted my instincts. It was a lesson I'll never forget. Trust your gut, and when the red flags start piling up, don't wait to see how the story ends. My friend, a fellow soldier and someone I'd always known to be tough as nails, leaned forward as we shared stories about strange encounters during a rare night off duty. But when it was her turn, her voice dropped, her expression darkened, and I knew this wasn't just another funny or awkward tale. "This one's different," she started, her tone serious. "It still gets to me, you know?" I nodded, bracing myself. She told me about how it began, a typical modern romance story, or so it seemed. She had been talking to a guy she'd met online, and everything had felt surprisingly normal. He was charming, friendly, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know her. After a few days of casual conversation, he suggested meeting up for drinks. No red flags, no warning signs, just a simple, seemingly innocent invitation. So she agreed. The bar was a cozy spot, tucked away in one of Norway's quieter neighborhoods. When she arrived, he was already there, smiling and waving her over like an old friend. The first round of drinks came and went, and the conversation flowed easily enough at first. He asked about her life in the military, her travels, and her interests. She started to relax, thinking this might actually turn into a good night. But then the questions began to shift. At first, it was subtle, questions that felt slightly deeper than typical first date fare. "What's the worst memory you have from childhood?" he asked, his eyes locked onto hers in an almost unnerving way. She brushed it off, giving a vague answer and steering the conversation elsewhere. But he didn't let up. "What's your first memory of anything? Intimate?" he asked next, his voice casual, but the question landed like a stone in her stomach. She laughed nervously, trying to dodge the question, but his persistence was unsettling. Every other topic seemed to circle back to something unnervingly personal, even dark. Still, he managed to maintain a facade of charm, keeping her from bolting out the door. When the drinks were finished, he suggested they continue the night at his place. She hesitated, but he seemed harmless enough, a little odd, sure, but not threatening. She agreed. His apartment was small but clean, almost sterile. Too sterile, she thought, but she pushed the thought aside. She excused herself to the bathroom, needing a moment to regroup and shake off the nagging unease creeping up her spine. As she washed her hands, she heard faint noises coming from another room. Curious, and now slightly on edge, she cracked the bathroom door open, careful not to make a sound. She followed the noise to a partially open door down the hall. Inside, she saw him moving around, his back to her. He was spreading thick sheets of plastic over the floor and walls, carefully smoothing out the edges as if preparing for something. The hair on her neck stood up. Her breath hitched, and her mind raced. This wasn't normal. This wasn't safe. She stepped back, careful not to make a sound, and quickly returned to the bathroom. Her reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed and panicked. She had to get out. Forcing herself to stay calm, she emerged from the bathroom, putting on her best casual smile. "Hey, I just remembered I've got an early shift tomorrow," she said, grabbing her bag and heading toward the door without waiting for a response. He watched her, his expression unreadable, but didn't try to stop her. She left as quickly as she could without breaking into a run. The moment she was safely outside, she called the police. She didn't expect much to come of it. Maybe they'd check in on him, maybe not. But to her surprise, her call set off a series of events that confirmed her worst fears. The man was already under surveillance for suspicious behavior, and her report gave them the probable cause they needed to search his apartment. What they found turned her stomach. The plastic wasn't for a home renovation project. It was preparation for something far more sinister. Tools, restraints, and other evidence suggested he was on the brink of committing something unthinkable. "I still think about what could have happened if I'd stayed," she told me, her voice heavy with lingering fear. "How close I came to being. I don't even know. Another statistic, maybe." Her story left me cold. It was a chilling reminder of how easily something that feels normal can take a turn into something dark. She's tough, no doubt about it, but even she admitted that night left scars she might never fully shake. The first time I saw her photo on Tinder, I was struck by her smile, bright, confident, and framed by golden blonde hair. Her profile was charming, filled with witty comments and quirky hobbies. She was fluent in German, she mentioned, though it seemed like a throwaway detail at the time. We matched quickly, and our conversations flowed effortlessly. She was funny, engaging, and best of all, seemed genuinely interested in me. Our first date is a blur now, but I remember walking away feeling like I'd hit the jackpot. We met up a few more times after that, each encounter reinforcing how much we clicked. Eventually, I found myself at her place, a cozy apartment filled with books, plants, and an inexplicable collection of miniature figurines. That night, things escalated naturally, and we ended up in her bed. At first, everything was perfect. She was beautiful, and the chemistry between us was undeniable. But somewhere in the heat of the moment, she started shouting in German. It was loud, passionate, and utterly unexpected. I froze for a split second, my mind scrambling to process the sudden switch to a language I couldn't understand. No offense to German speakers, but it's not exactly a language that screams romance. It's more like a drill sergeant barking commands. Her words rolled out in sharp, guttural bursts, and I was equal parts fascinated and terrified. I had no idea what she was saying. Was she complimenting me? Giving instructions? Cursing me out? The sheer unpredictability of it threw me off my rhythm completely. Still, I powered through, convincing myself this was just one of her quirks. It wasn't a deal breaker, just a surprise. A week later, we decided to grab drinks at a local bar she suggested. It was one of those laid-back spots with dim lighting and an impressive collection of craft beers. When we walked in, she greeted the bartender with a familiarity that made me pause. They laughed, exchanged a few words, and he even asked how she'd been. Curious, I asked her how she knew him once he'd stepped away. She smiled casually and said, "Oh, that's my ex-husband." I nearly choked on my drink. "Ex-husband?" I repeated, trying to process what I'd just heard. We were both in our 20s. How did someone our age already have an ex-husband? "Yeah," she said nonchalantly. "We were married for about 2 years. It's cool, though. We're still friends." She shrugged it off like it was no big deal, but my mind was reeling. I looked back at the bartender, who was casually wiping down glasses, as if this was the most normal situation in the world. Before I could ask anything else, she excused herself to use the bathroom. The moment she disappeared, the bartender leaned over the counter with a sly grin. "So," he said, his tone dripping with amusement, "how are you liking the German in bed?" I blinked, stunned into silence. Of all the things he could have said, that was the last one I expected. Still caught off guard, I stammered, "It's all right." He winked at me. Before I could gather my thoughts, she returned, sliding into her seat beside me as if nothing had happened. The bartender didn't miss a beat, acting like the brief exchange between us had never occurred. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, but the whole situation left me with an odd feeling I couldn't shake. She was great, fun, attractive, and smart, but there was something about her unpredictability that made me hesitate. The German outbursts, the casual mention of an ex-husband who happened to be serving us drinks. It was all just a bit much. We hung out a few more times before things fizzled out naturally. There wasn't any dramatic ending, just a quiet realization that we weren't quite the right fit for each other. I still go to that bar occasionally, and every time I do, the bartender greets me with a knowing smile. He always comps my first drink, which I like to think of as a silent acknowledgement of the bizarre shared experience. The first time I met him, he seemed confident, charming even. He had that air of someone who knows exactly what they want, a quality that, in the right amount, can be magnetic. He planned our first date without much input from me, choosing the restaurant, the time, even the route we took to get there. It felt a little controlling, but I brushed it off. Maybe he's just trying to be chivalrous, I told myself. Some people like to take charge, and maybe he thought I'd appreciate it. That night went fine enough, though something about him kept me slightly on edge. He was polite, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in me, but there was a tension simmering beneath the surface. Little comments he made, subtle digs at how I held my fork or the way I laughed, pricked at me like tiny needles. I ignored them, chalking it up to first date awkwardness. When he asked for a second date, I hesitated for a moment, but eventually agreed. He suggested we go to London for the evening, saying he'd handle all the details. The vagueness immediately set off alarms in my mind. I tried to be casual about it, asking where in London we were going and what he had planned, but he dodged the question. "It's a surprise," he said with a smug grin, like that would put me at ease. I pressed further, explaining that I needed to know at least a little about where we were going, mostly for safety, though I didn't say that outright. "I just need to know what to wear," I lied, hoping that would prompt him to share more. His response was strange. "Wear a dress," he said flatly, as though it were in order. I felt my stomach twist. I never wear dresses, they're not my style, and I wasn't about to start now just because someone else told me to. "I don't really do dresses," I replied lightly, trying to keep the mood from souring. "I'll just wear something comfortable." His reaction was immediate and sharp. His tone, which had been playful before, hardened. "Why do you have to be so difficult?" he snapped. "Can't you just go along with it for once?" For once? We'd only met once. I felt my chest tighten. Something about the way he spoke sent a chill down my spine. "I don't think I'm being difficult," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. "I just want to know where we're going. It's not too much to ask." That's when he lost it. His words spilled out like venom, his face twisting with anger. "You're such a stuck-up bitch," he spat, his voice shaking with frustration. "Always playing games. You're nothing but a cock tease." I froze, my heart pounding as his words sank in. The anger in his voice was startling, the kind that makes your instincts scream at you to get away as fast as possible. This wasn't someone who'd read me wrong or misunderstood my boundaries. This was someone who didn't think they mattered at all. "I don't think this is going to work," I said quietly, already reaching for my phone. "You're out of order," he barked, but I wasn't listening anymore. My hands shook as I opened the app and blocked him. His messages disappeared instantly, replaced by an eerie silence that hung over me for the rest of the night. It wasn't until later, sitting alone in my room, that the full weight of what had happened hit me. I'd felt uneasy around him from the beginning, but I'd ignored those feelings, convincing myself that I was overreacting. Now, I realized just how close I'd come to something far worse than an uncomfortable date. The next day, I deleted his number and told a few close friends what had happened, partly for my own safety and partly as a reminder to myself that I wasn't being difficult. I was setting boundaries, something he clearly couldn't handle. That experience stayed with me, not because of how it ended, but because of what it taught me. Trusting your instincts isn't just important, it's necessary. And anyone who makes you feel like you're being too much for wanting to feel safe isn't someone worth your time. In hindsight, the red flags had been there all along. I just needed to learn how to see them. I was sitting across from him, a man I'd matched with on Match.com who seemed decent enough online. His profile had been straightforward, his messages polite, and I figured I'd give it a shot. But from the moment we sat down, something felt off. It wasn't the kind of unease that screamed danger, more like a subtle wrongness that I couldn't quite put my finger on. He chewed gum constantly, even as he greeted me. Not just chewing, but snapping it loudly between his teeth. It was a minor annoyance, but I brushed it off. Everyone has quirks, right? The conversation started fine. Small talk, a few jokes, nothing groundbreaking. But as the night went on, his comments grew increasingly strange. I'd always been honest in my profile about being a UK size 14 to 16, confident in who I was, and unapologetic about my curves. At one point, I made a light-hearted joke about my fat arse, something I often did to disarm potential awkwardness. Without missing a beat, he looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Yes, I noticed." His tone was flat, devoid of humor or charm, and his words landed like a slap. I laughed awkwardly, unsure how to respond. Was it an insult? An observation? A clumsy attempt at a joke? Whatever it was, it felt unnecessarily rude. The silence that followed hung in the air like a bad smell, and I suddenly found myself counting the minutes until the date was over. Then there was the gum. He'd been chewing it the entire time, which was bad enough, but when our meals arrived, he casually plucked it from his mouth and stuck it onto the side plate meant for bread. My stomach churned as I watched him leave it there, clearly intending for the waitress to deal with it. It wasn't just gross, it was disrespectful. I tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, determined to salvage what was left of the evening. But it was like trying to start a fire in the rain. He answered my questions with disinterested shrugs or one-word replies, making no effort to keep the dialogue alive. I felt like I was interviewing him for a job he didn't want. The final nail in the coffin came when we bumped into one of my colleagues. She was tipsy and cheerful, clearly enjoying her night out, and she stumbled over to say hello. "Fabergé is the best boss ever," she slurred, throwing her arms around me in an overly enthusiastic hug. I laughed, brushing it off with a wave of my hand. "I'm really not," I said, trying to downplay her drunken praise. But when I glanced back at my date, his reaction made my stomach sink. He didn't smile, didn't laugh, didn't even acknowledge her. Instead, he turned his back to her completely, like she wasn't worth his time. The blatant rudeness of it left me speechless. My colleague, oblivious to the slight, eventually wandered off, but I was done. "I think I'm going to call it a night," I said, forcing a polite smile as I reached for my bag. He didn't argue or ask why. Instead, as I turned to leave, he made one final move that turned the evening from disappointing to outright bizarre. He leaned toward me as if to say goodbye, but instead attempted to shoulder bump me, a move that seemed both petty and unnecessarily aggressive. He missed, the motion clumsy and awkward, and I was too stunned to react. I didn't look back as I walked out the door. The moment I got home, I blocked him on Match.com and reported him for his behavior. I wasn't sure if it would make a difference, but it felt like the least I could do. I couldn't believe I'd wasted an evening on someone so lacking in basic decency. Looking back, it wasn't just his comments or his behavior that bothered me. It was the way he seemed to revel in being inconsiderate, as though he found power in making others uncomfortable. It was a stark reminder that, no matter how polished someone seems online, you can't truly know who they are until you meet them in person. The next day, I deleted our messages, erasing any trace of him from my phone. The date was a disaster, but it left me with a clear resolution. Never ignore your instincts, especially when someone shows you who they really are. I'd agreed to meet her here, at a Starbucks, for our first date. It felt casual, low stakes, a safe way to see if there was a spark. Her profile had been intriguing, funny, intelligent, passionate about animal rights. I wasn't vegan, but she'd assured me she was fine with that. The door chimed as she walked in, her blonde hair pulled into a sleek ponytail and a brightly colored tote bag slung over her shoulder. She smiled, and for a moment, I felt my nerves settle. She was just as pretty as her photos, and I thought, this could actually go well. We exchanged pleasantries and joined the line. As we waited, she casually mentioned her veganism again, saying it was more than just a diet. It was her way of life. I nodded, listening, and reassured her that I respected her choices. She seemed satisfied with that and smiled, her demeanor calm and confident. When it was my turn to order, I asked for my usual, a coffee with cream. The moment the words left my mouth, the air around us shifted. She froze, her smile vanishing. Her eyes widened in shock, and for a second, I thought I'd misspoken. Then, in a voice that seemed to echo through the entire cafe, she shouted, "You're a cow murderer." Every head in the room turned toward us. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, cups clattered onto saucers, and the baristas paused in their movements, their expressions a mix of confusion and disbelief. My face flushed hot as her words registered. She wasn't joking, she was furious. "You're contributing to the torture and slaughter of innocent animals," she continued, her voice rising with each word. "Do you even know what they go through? You're complicit in their suffering." I stood there, stunned, my mind racing to catch up. This wasn't just a passionate outburst, it was a full-blown scene, and I was at the center of it. People were staring, some whispering, others outright gawking. I tried to stammer out a response, something to defuse the situation, but my words caught in my throat. The barista behind the counter glanced at me nervously, unsure whether to hand over my drink or wait for the storm to pass. "Look," I finally managed, my voice low, "I respect your choices, but this isn't the time or place for this." She didn't hear me, or maybe she didn't care. She was too busy listing the horrors of the dairy industry, her voice trembling with emotion. I could feel my chest tightening, the weight of dozens of eyes pressing down on me. I hadn't come here to debate ethics or become the target of a public shaming. I'd come for coffee and a conversation. I glanced at the exit, calculating the quickest way out of this situation. My drink was finally placed on the counter, but I didn't even reach for it. Instead, I pulled out my wallet, handed over the cash to pay for both our orders, and said, "I think I'll leave." Her expression flickered for a moment, shock, maybe even regret, but she didn't stop me. I grabbed my receipt and headed for the door, the whispers of the other patrons following me like a shadow. The cool air outside hit my face, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside me. As I walked to my car, I replayed the scene in my mind, each detail sharpening with every step. Her anger, the way she'd weaponized the moment to make a public point, the looks on the faces of strangers, all of it felt surreal. I'd expected differences in opinion, maybe even a light-hearted debate, but not this. When I got home, I blocked her number and deleted our chats. I wasn't angry, not exactly, more bewildered than anything. It was clear we were on entirely different wavelengths, and any chance of a second date had been obliterated in that Starbucks. Later, I told my friends about it, and they laughed, calling it a classic Tinder horror story. But for me, it was more than just an awkward encounter. It was a reminder that some people's passion, no matter how admirable, can blind them to the line between conviction and respect. And as much as I admired her dedication, I knew I needed something simpler, someone who could let me drink my coffee in peace. The sun was setting as we strolled along the trail, the sky painted with hues of gold and lavender. Every word she spoke felt like it had weight, yet her laughter was light enough to make my heart lift. From the moment I met her, I was convinced she was it, the one. We walked for hours, lost in conversation, our steps falling in sync as if we'd done this 1,000 times before. She was smart, kind, and stunningly beautiful in a way that made you forget what you were saying mid-sentence. We had planned to head to the beach after our walk, but as luck would have it, the skies darkened and rain started to fall. I suggested heading somewhere else, maybe grabbing a coffee or finding a cozy spot indoors, but she surprised me. "Your mom lives nearby, right?" she asked, her smile disarming. "I'd love to meet her." I hesitated. Meeting my mom on the first date? That wasn't in the playbook, but she was so sincere, so at ease, that I found myself agreeing. "All right," I said, trying to mask my nerves. To my surprise, it wasn't awkward at all. My mom took to her immediately, and she fit right in, joining the conversation as if she'd been part of the family for years. We shared dinner, laughing and swapping stories, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't expected, hope. Afterward, my mom went upstairs to grab something, and she excused herself to the bathroom. As I was heading back down the landing, she appeared, her eyes catching mine in the dim light. Without hesitation, she reached out, her fingers brushing mine before she leaned in and kissed me. It was soft and sweet, yet it left me reeling. I couldn't believe how perfect everything felt. The next time we met, it was at my place. We talked for hours before the night turned intimate. It was effortless, like we had always been meant to find each other. Everything about her felt right. When I told her I had to go away for work for a month, she didn't flinch. I understand, she said, her voice steady and supportive. It's your job, and I know how much you love it. I'll be here when you get back. Her understanding only deepened my feelings for her. When I returned, everything picked up right where we'd left off. She greeted me with the same warmth, the same spark, as if no time had passed at all. A month later, we decided to go on holiday together. A week of sun, sea, and everything that felt like love. It was perfect. Every day felt like a dream, and as we shared quiet moments on the beach or laughed over dinner, I thought, this is it. This is the person I want to spend my life with. The holiday ended too soon. On the train ride back from the airport, we sat close, stealing kisses and whispering plans for the future. Her stop came first, and as she got off, she turned back for one last hug, her hand lingering on mine. I'll see you soon, she said, her smile as bright as ever. But that was the last time I saw her. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding. I texted her later that week, and her reply was brief. I just need some space. I told her I understood, gave her time, and waited. I had to go away for work again, and when I came back, I reached out. Want to grab lunch? I asked, hopeful. Her reply shattered me. I'm over it, she said. I've moved on. I couldn't believe it. Everything had been perfect, or at least I thought it had been. We'd laughed, shared dreams, created memories that I replayed in my mind like scenes from a movie. How had it all unraveled so quickly? What had I done wrong? For weeks, I replayed every conversation, every moment, searching for answers. Was it something I'd said? Something I hadn't done? The silence left by her absence was deafening, and no matter how much time passed, I couldn't shake the feeling of loss. The pub was lively that evening, buzzing with chatter and laughter, the kind of place that felt like a safe choice for a last-minute Tinder date. I wasn't expecting much, just a drink and a chance to see if there was a connection. When I arrived, I spotted him right away, sitting at a table near the back. But something was immediately off. As I approached, I noticed a gash on his forehead, fresh, gooey, and alarmingly out of place. It wasn't a small cut you could ignore. It looked recent and serious enough to demand an explanation. My stomach tightened as I slid into the chair across from him. Hey, I said cautiously, gesturing to his forehead. What happened? Are you okay? He blinked at me, looking genuinely confused. What do you mean? He asked, tilting his head like I'd just mentioned something absurd. I stared at him, waiting for him to crack a smile or offer an explanation, but he didn't. He seemed completely oblivious to the fact that there was a gaping wound on his face. My unease grew, but I decided not to push. Maybe he didn't want to talk about it, or maybe this was just one of those quirks you encountered in online dating. Still, the air between us felt heavier than it should have for a first meeting. We ordered drinks, and as the conversation began, the tension only deepened. He wasted no time diving into the story of his last relationship. I just got out of something pretty serious, he started, swirling his drink with a distracted air. Yeah, I asked, trying to sound polite, but already feeling wary. He nodded. It was with an older woman. We were together for about a year. That wasn't unusual, but his tone hinted at something darker. What happened? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. He hesitated, then leaned in as if sharing a scandalous secret. She slept with her son's best friend, he said flatly. The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. I blinked, unsure I'd heard him correctly. Her son's best friend? I repeated, my voice trailing off. Yeah, he said, taking a sip of his drink. The kid was 15. My stomach turned. I felt like the floor had just dropped out from under me. So, you were dating someone who... He cut me off with a shrug, as if brushing away the weight of what he'd just admitted. Yeah, I guess you could say she had some issues. Some issues? The words escaped before I could stop them. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. He'd just casually admitted to being in a relationship with someone who had committed a heinous act, and he didn't seem the least bit fazed by it. I glanced at the wound on his forehead again, the uneasiness in my chest growing heavier. The fact that he didn't acknowledge it, didn't even seem to realize it was there, made the whole situation feel surreal, like I was trapped in a scene from a movie that didn't make sense. Look, I said finally, my voice calm but firm. It seems like you've got a lot going on right now. I don't think this is a good idea. He frowned, but before he could respond, I reached into my bag, pulled out a 5-pound note, and set it on the table. For my drink, I said, standing up. I didn't wait for him to argue or try to stop me. I grabbed my coat and left, the cool night air hitting me like a wave of relief. My heart was pounding, and my thoughts were racing. Who was this guy? Why hadn't he been more disturbed by his ex's actions? And what in the world had happened to his forehead? Even now, I still wonder about him. Did he ever figure out what caused the wound? Did he even care? And what became of the woman he'd dated? The one who'd shattered lives without a second thought. 2 years ago, I matched with someone who seemed almost too good to be true. His profile was everything I could have dreamed of: successful, philanthropic, and kind-hearted. He wasn't just wealthy. He'd made millions through a groundbreaking software invention and used his fortune to give back in ways that resonated deeply with me. Articles online painted a picture of a brilliant, selfless individual. He donated countless computers to underserved students in developing countries and given substantial funds to charities working in sectors I was passionate about. For someone like me, working in philanthropy and striving to make an impact in the world, meeting someone who shared those values was thrilling. I'd grown tired of dating guys who were either too detached or had no direction in life. This was someone who seemed like a real partner, someone with drive, compassion, and a sense of purpose. When we arranged to meet, I was filled with anticipation. But the moment he walked into the cafe, my excitement flickered, then dimmed. Something was off. He looked disheveled, like he hadn't showered in days. A thick gold chain hung awkwardly around his neck, clashing with the image I'd built of him in my head. And then there was his manner, subtle at first, but undeniably strange. He mumbled to himself occasionally, his lips moving as if he were in a private conversation with someone invisible. Still, I reminded myself not to judge too quickly. Maybe he was nervous. Maybe he had quirks. It wasn't until the conversation started that I realized just how deep those quirks went. From the very beginning, he was intense. He told me, without hesitation, that he believed in astrology and conspiracy theories. Not just casual ones, but the kind that spiral into complete absurdity. He spoke about psychic powers as if they were an everyday reality, claiming he could manifest people into his life just by thinking about them. Whenever I need to hire someone, he said with a grin, I picture them in my mind, and within days they show up in my office. I forced a smile, unsure how to respond. He didn't stop there. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Anderson Cooper is a lizard person, he said seriously, nodding like he'd just shared the world's best-kept secret. I blinked, my brain scrambling to keep up. The logical side of me was ready to shut this down and leave, but I was also fascinated, morbidly curious about how far this conversation would go. This man, who had achieved so much, was sitting across from me talking about psychic powers and reptilian overlords. 2 hours passed in a blur of the strangest, most surreal conversation of my life. And keep in mind, I work with traumatized children displaced from their homes. I thought I'd seen and heard it all. But this was on another level. When the date ended, I politely declined his immediate request for a second. He nodded, seemingly unbothered, but an hour later my phone buzzed. How about a trip to Paris, he wrote. All expenses paid. Just you and me. We'll leave next week. I stared at the message, stunned. When I said no, he escalated. What if I offered you a $150,000 job at my company? Another no. Okay, for $100,000. Final offer. It was baffling. Here was this man throwing money and opportunities at me, as if they could buy my interest, completely oblivious to the fact that I wasn't looking for wealth or grand gestures. I wanted connection, depth, someone grounded in reality. This was the opposite of that. Over the next 6 to 8 months, he continued to reach out sporadically. His messages were bizarre updates about his life, tech deals he'd closed, pictures of himself in exotic locations, musings about his charity work. Sometimes he asked for advice, like I was some sort of consultant for his personal and professional life. I kept my replies brief and polite, hoping he'd take the hint. Eventually, he stopped messaging. He faded into the background, though his Instagram profile occasionally popped up in my, you might consider following, suggestions. I blocked him everywhere, unwilling to leave even a digital door open for him to step through. Looking back, it's almost funny. He wasn't a bad person, just profoundly strange. I think he genuinely believed everything he said, including the conspiracies and psychic powers. Maybe he was lonely. Maybe he was searching for something no amount of money or success could give him. Either way, I've never forgotten that date. It was a lesson in appearances, in how someone can seem perfect on paper, but turn out to be something entirely unexpected. And to this day, whenever I hear someone mention lizard people, I can't help but think of him. What a weird guy. I sat across from her, a woman I'd been seeing for a few weeks now. She was charming, effortlessly so, with a quick wit and an infectious laugh. By the fifth date, I thought I knew her, or at least enough to see where this could go. We'd met through a mutual friend, someone who swore we'd hit it off, and to my surprise, they were right. The first date was casual, filled with light conversation and easy laughter. The second and third dates were much the same. By the fourth, I was already envisioning the possibility of something serious. She was intelligent, beautiful, and seemed genuinely interested in me. It was refreshing. On this particular evening, as we shared dessert and talked about nothing in particular, the conversation took a turn. She glanced down at her plate, hesitating, her fork tracing circles in her tiramisu. "I need to tell you something," she began, her voice quieter than usual. I froze, bracing myself for whatever was coming. "Okay," I said, trying to sound casual, even as my chest tightened. She looked up, her eyes locking onto mine. "I have 2 kids." The words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. I blinked, unsure how to respond. 2 kids? She'd never mentioned them before, not even a hint. I felt a wave of emotions, surprise, confusion, but not anger. I took a breath and nodded. "All right," I said carefully. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" "I wasn't sure how you'd react," she admitted, her voice tinged with nervousness. A lot of guys run when they hear that. I thought about it for a moment. It was a lot to process, sure, but it wasn't a deal breaker. "Thanks for telling me," I said finally. "It doesn't change how I feel about you." Her face relaxed, the tension in her shoulders easing. I thought that was the end of it, but then she hesitated again, her fork stilling midair. "There's something else," she said. My stomach dropped. The way she said it made my pulse quicken, a sense of foreboding creeping in. "What is it?" I asked, my voice steady, though my hands felt clammy. "I'm married," she said, the words cutting through the quiet hum of the cafe like a knife. I stared at her, waiting for her to say she was joking, that this was some kind of twisted test. But her expression didn't waver. She wasn't joking. "Married?" I repeated, the word tasting foreign and bitter on my tongue. She nodded, her gaze dropping to the table. "We're not together like that anymore," she said quickly, as if that would soften the blow. "It's just complicated. We've been growing apart for years." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The woman I'd started to fall for had been hiding this monumental truth. "So, let me get this straight," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "You've been dating me while married?" "Yes, but—" she began, but I cut her off. "Do you realize how wrong this is?" I asked, my voice rising. The people at the table next to us glanced over, but I didn't care. "What about him? Does he know? Or your kids? How could you think this is okay?" Her face flushed, but she didn't look ashamed. Instead, she reached across the table, her hand brushing mine. "I can leave him for you," she said softly, her eyes wide and pleading. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Leave him for me?" As if that would fix anything. My chest tightened, a mix of anger and disbelief swirling inside me. "Do you hear yourself?" I asked, pulling my hand away. "If you can do this to him, what's to stop you from doing the same to me?" She opened her mouth to reply, but I didn't wait to hear what she had to say. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor as I pushed it back. I couldn't stay there a second longer. "I'm done," I said, grabbing my coat. "You need to figure out your life before dragging someone else into this mess." She called after me, her voice soft but desperate, but I didn't look back. My mind was racing as I stepped out into the cold night air. I felt sick, my stomach churning as I replayed the conversation in my head. How had I been so blind? How had she fooled me so easily? The walk back to my car felt longer than usual. By the time I sat behind the wheel, the initial shock had worn off, replaced by a numb kind of disbelief. I'd thought she was someone I could trust, someone genuine, and instead, she'd been lying from the start. For days, I couldn't stop thinking about it, replaying every moment we'd spent together, every word she'd said. I wanted to find some sign I'd missed, some clue that could explain how I hadn't seen it sooner. But there was nothing, just the sinking realization that I'd been taken in by someone who wasn't who they claimed to be. In the end, I blocked her number, deleted her from my life, and tried to move on. But even now, when I think about her, a part of me still feels that same nauseating twist in my gut. Trust, I've learned, is a fragile thing, and once it's broken, there's no putting it back together. She was sitting by the window when I arrived, her face softly lit by the afternoon sun, a smile that was warm and inviting. She waved me over, and for a fleeting moment I thought this could be something good. But I wasn't in the right headspace. Not even close. The night before, I'd been in a boxing match, the kind of fight that sticks with you long after you leave the ring. My body was sore, my knuckles raw, and my mind wouldn't stop replaying every punch, every feint, every mistake. I'd spent the morning obsessively analyzing the video my coach had taken, dissecting every frame like it held the secret to unlocking perfection. The adrenaline hadn't faded, and neither had my frustration. I sat down across from her, my shoulders tense. She greeted me with a kind smile and asked how I was doing. I don't remember my exact response, but it wasn't anything remotely close to what a date should have started with. Instead of asking her about herself, instead of easing into a conversation, I launched straight into my fight. "It was this close," I said, holding my fingers an inch apart. I had him on the ropes in the second round, but I couldn't finish it. My guard slipped. My coach said it's because I was overextending, but I think it was more about my footing. I wasn't planted right, you know. She nodded politely, her smile fading slightly, but I didn't notice. I was too wrapped up in my own world, my own narrative. "I've got the video," I continued, pulling out my phone without even asking if she cared. "Here, let me show you." She hesitated, but I was already hitting play, leaning across the table to angle the screen toward her. The video began, the faint sounds of punches and grunts filling the cafe as I narrated every moment. "See that jab? I should have doubled up on it," I said, pointing at the screen. "And here, right here, I missed a perfect counter. It's like I wasn't even seeing the openings." She made a soft noise of acknowledgement, something between a hum and a sigh, but I didn't catch the hint. I was too busy critiquing myself, replaying the moments where I thought I'd failed. The conversation was a one-man show, me talking at her rather than with her. I barely gave her a chance to speak. When the server brought our drinks, she tried to shift the focus, asking me about something non-boxing related. I answered briefly, then somehow looped it back to the fight. "It's just that I know I can do better," I said, shaking my head. "It's all about discipline, right? I've got to train harder, get sharper, figure out what went wrong." She smiled faintly, stirring her coffee, and offered a few words of encouragement. But even then, I wasn't really listening. I was too deep in my own thoughts, running through strategies and what-ifs as if she wasn't even there. The date dragged on, and with every passing minute, her energy dwindled. She stopped trying to interject, stopped offering polite comments, and just sipped her coffee quietly while I rambled. By the time I finally paused long enough to ask her a question, something generic like, "So what about you?" the moment had already passed. She gave a short, clipped answer and glanced at the clock on her phone. "I should probably get going soon," she said, her tone polite but distant. It hit me then, a sudden realization that I'd completely botched the entire date. She hadn't been rude or impatient. She'd just been overshadowed by my inability to get out of my own head. I tried to salvage it, offering to pay for her drink, but she shook her head and insisted on splitting the bill. As she walked out of the cafe, I sat there staring at the remnants of my coffee, feeling like an idiot. I didn't expect to hear from her again, and sure enough, she ghosted me. No text, no follow-up, just radio silence. I couldn't blame her. I'd spent the entire date treating her like a sounding board for my own nonsense. That night, as I lay in bed replaying the day in my head, I realized how badly I'd miscalculated. She deserved someone who was present, someone who cared enough to ask her about her life and actually listen. Instead, I'd turned what could have been a meaningful connection into a self-centered monologue about my fight. The lesson hit me hard. If you've got a load of unresolved thoughts or emotions swirling around in your head, deal with them before going on a date. Call a friend, rant to your coach, or just scream into a pillow. Anything to get it out of your system. But don't drag someone else into your storm, especially someone who's there to get to know you, not your baggage. It's been 2 years since that date, but I still think about it sometimes. Not because I miss her, I barely got to know her, but because it reminds me how important it is to be present, to value the time and energy someone else is willing to share with you. It's a mistake I won't make again. He was a full foot shorter than he'd claimed, and at least a decade older. His tight white jeans, practically painted on, only emphasized the stark contrast between the version of him I thought I'd meet and the reality in front of me. My stomach sank, a wave of disbelief washing over me. I stayed rooted to my spot near the corner table, momentarily frozen by the shock. But then he saw me, his face lighting up in recognition. He strode, no strutted, toward me, his jeans creaking audibly with each step. The glint in his eye suggested he was far too pleased with himself, as if he'd just stepped out of a cologne commercial instead of shattering any hope I'd had for this date. As he approached, I instinctively took a step back. His arms opened wide, and before I could even process what was happening, he lunged at me. His mouth was wide open, aiming for what I could only assume was meant to be a passionate kiss. Time seemed to slow down, my brain screaming for me to react. I twisted to the side, narrowly dodging him. His momentum carried him slightly forward, leaving him momentarily off balance. The awkwardness of it all made my face burn with secondhand embarrassment. Hi, I said, my voice strained as I put more distance between us. He straightened up, recovering from his failed ambush, and grinned as if nothing had happened. Hey, gorgeous, he drawled, his tone dripping with confidence that seemed misplaced given the situation. I couldn't do it. I couldn't sit through this date, pretending like this was okay. Everything about him, from the blatant lies about his height and age to the cringe-inducing white jeans, screamed red flags. But what truly sealed the deal was his behavior, so forward and presumptuous that it left me deeply uncomfortable. I'm sorry, I stammered, already stepping toward the door. This isn't going to work. What? He said, his grin faltering. Wait, hold on a second. But I didn't stop. The sheer absurdity of the situation made my legs move faster. I pushed through the cafe door and stepped into the crisp evening air, my heart racing as I put distance between us. I could still feel the phantom heat of his attempted kiss, the sound of his jeans stretching echoing in my ears. As I walked briskly down the street, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Against my better judgment, I pulled it out to check. It was a text from him. Was it the jeans? I stared at the screen, my disbelief turning into something close to laughter. It was almost impressive how oblivious he seemed to everything else that had gone wrong. The jeans weren't the reason. Well, not the reason, but they certainly hadn't helped. I shoved my phone back into my pocket and kept walking, not bothering to reply. As I replayed the brief encounter in my head, I couldn't help but marvel at the sheer audacity of it all. The lies, the over-the-top confidence, the jeans. It felt like a bad rom-com, except I was the unwilling protagonist in a scene that was more cringe than comedy. By the time I got home, I'd already decided to delete the app. Dating was hard enough without adding outright deception into the mix. The experience left a bad taste in my mouth, not because he wasn't perfect, nobody is, but because he'd chosen to present a version of himself so far from reality that it felt insulting. Did he really think I wouldn't notice? That I'd just go along with it, ignoring the glaring mismatch between expectation and reality? I vented to my roommate that night, recounting every detail from the jeans to the lunge. She laughed so hard she nearly choked on her tea, but I couldn't blame her. The whole thing was absurd. You should have just texted back. Yes, it was the jeans, she said through her giggles. Maybe I should have, I replied, shaking my head. But honestly, I don't think he'd have gotten the point. The experience taught me a few things. First, trust your instincts. If something feels off from the start, like someone overcompensating in their profile, it probably is. Second, no matter how disheartening dating can be, it's better to walk away than to force yourself to endure something that makes you uncomfortable. And finally, if someone shows up in tight white jeans and lunges at you open-mouthed before even saying hello, run. Looking back, I can laugh about it now, the memory becoming one of those wild dating stories you tell at parties. But in the moment, it reminded me of the importance of boundaries and self-respect. Dating is a strange, unpredictable journey, and while there are bound to be missteps along the way, you learn to laugh, let go, and move forward. And yes, it was the jeans. The night started innocently enough, a casual group gathering at the pub where conversation flowed freely. We talked about movies, classics, franchises, upcoming releases. He seemed nice enough, chiming in with enthusiasm and a shared love for sci-fi. Then he asked, "Want to see the new Star Wars film with us?" At the time, it sounded harmless. Us implied a group outing, friends bonding over a blockbuster. I agreed without hesitation, thinking it was just another casual plan. What I didn't know was that us meant just him. The realization hit me when I arrived at the cinema. I scanned the crowd for familiar faces, but only saw him rushing toward me, out of breath. "Sorry I'm late," he said, waving a hand. "My stupid dad didn't leave the house on time to drive me here." I froze for a second. This guy was in his 20s and had arrived with his dad as a chauffeur. Not the most promising start, but I brushed it off. Everyone's circumstances are different, I told myself. Maybe he'd redeem himself. He didn't. We grabbed popcorn. Well, he grabbed it, practically snatching the tub from the counter with a level of enthusiasm I hadn't seen in years. He began devouring it in fistfuls, not bothering to close his mouth as he chewed. Each loud crunch felt like nails on a chalkboard. People in the cinema turned to glance at us, but he didn't notice, or didn't care. The lights dimmed, and I hoped the movie would salvage the evening. It didn't. About 20 minutes in, I felt him lean closer. "Very fit you are, he whispered in my ear. His voice was low and gravelly, like a bad Yoda impression, and I wasn't sure whether to cringe or laugh. I opted for neither, ignoring him in hopes he'd stop. He didn't. Every few minutes, there it was again. "Very fit you are, The first time was awkward. The 10th was unbearable. I shifted in my seat, pretending to focus intensely on the movie, but he leaned in again, unfazed by my clear discomfort. By the time the credits rolled, I felt like I'd been held hostage in a sci-fi nightmare. The ordeal wasn't over. As we left the theater, he glanced around, his phone in hand. "Can I grab a lift with you?" he asked. "I can't get hold of my dad, and I don't have money for a taxi." It was late, and I knew the walk back to our village was a solid 80 minutes. My dad's voice echoed in my head, "Make sure everyone gets home safely." Reluctantly, I agreed. I just wanted the evening to be over. The car ride was mercifully quiet, though the popcorn crumbs on his shirt and the faint scent of butter lingering in the air were reminders of the chaos I'd just endured. As I pulled up outside his parents' house, I thought I'd made it out unscathed. Then he leaned in, not for a friendly peck or a polite thank you. He went for the full romantic kiss, his face coming toward mine like a slow-motion train wreck. I froze for a split second, then swerved just in time, his lips narrowly missing my cheek. He paused, clearly disappointed, then shrugged as if nothing had happened. I gave him a tight-lipped smile and mumbled, "Good night," watching as he trudged up the driveway. Relief washed over me as I drove away. Dodged a bullet there, I thought, determined to put the whole debacle behind me. But the story didn't end there. A week later, my phone rang. His name lit up on the screen, and against my better judgment, I answered. He asked me for a second date, his voice hopeful. I hesitated, unsure of how to let him down gently. "I don't think we're a good match," I said, choosing my words carefully. There was silence on the other end. Then, without warning, he snapped. "Fine," he barked, slamming the phone down so hard I could almost hear the echo. I stared at the phone in disbelief, a mix of annoyance and relief settling over me. At least it was over. No lingering awkwardness, no expectations, just a clean break from what was easily the worst date of my life. That night, as I recounted the experience to a friend, she laughed so hard she nearly spilled her drink. "Lesson learned," she said between giggles. "Always ask who's coming." It was advice I took to heart. From that point on, I made it a rule to clarify every plan, to double-check every detail before agreeing to anything. Because sometimes, the difference between a harmless group outing and a cringeworthy solo date is just one poorly chosen pronoun. Now, years later, I still cringe when I think about that night. But I also laugh. It's one of those stories you tell at parties, the kind people can't believe actually happened. And while I haven't watched that Star Wars film again, I'll never forget the lesson it taught me. Trust your instincts and always know exactly what you're signing up for. She waved from a corner booth, a wide smile on her face. I smiled back, nerves fluttering in my chest. Meeting someone new always came with its share of uncertainty, but tonight felt like it had potential. We settled into conversation easily enough. She was funny, charming even, and her stories had a way of drawing you in. I thought this might actually turn out to be a good night. Then, about 20 minutes in, she tilted her head, gave me a serious look, and asked, "Would you marry my niece?" I blinked, unsure if I'd misheard her. "What?" "My niece," she repeated, as though she were asking me to pass the salt. "She needs a passport. If you marry her, it'd help her out a lot." I stared at her, my mind racing. Was she joking? Testing me? But her expression remained calm, sincere even, like she genuinely expected me to consider the proposal. I forced a laugh, trying to lighten the moment. "That's an unusual request." She shrugged, as if she hadn't just dropped the most absurd question I'd ever heard on a first date. "Think about it," she said, her tone casual. The evening pressed on, and somehow we moved past the bizarre marriage request. I wasn't sure what kept me sitting there, curiosity, disbelief, or maybe just the sheer strangeness of it all. By the time we left the pub, she invited me back to her place. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Her apartment was small but cozy, the kind of place that felt lived in. We sat on the couch, talking late into the night. At one point, the conversation drifted toward religion. She told me she couldn't sleep with me because I wasn't Muslim. The statement was matter of fact, like it was simply a rule she lived by. I nodded, unsure how to respond. The night had already veered into the surreal, and this felt like just another twist in the narrative. Still, she offered me her bed to sleep in. "You can stay," she said. "Just don't try anything." I agreed, too tired to argue or overthink it. I climbed into bed, careful to stay on my side, while she lay next to me. Despite the strangeness of the situation, I managed to fall asleep, comforted by the silence of the room. Morning came, and I woke to the feeling of her weight on me. My eyes shot open to find her straddling me, a mischievous grin on her face. "Good morning," she said, her tone playful. Before I could process what was happening, she leaned down and kissed me. Any thoughts of boundaries or her earlier declaration evaporated in an instant. The night's confusion gave way to something unexpected, and before I knew it, we'd crossed a line neither of us had anticipated. The moment was intense, electric, but fleeting. As soon as it was over, her demeanor shifted. She got up, her expression cool, and said, "You should go." I sat up, still trying to piece together what had just happened. "Are you serious?" I asked, half laughing, half confused. She nodded, already gathering my things. "I need to get ready for the day," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. I dressed quickly, the surreal nature of the past 12 hours hitting me like a tidal wave. The marriage request, the religious barrier, the sudden intimacy, and now the abrupt dismissal. It all felt like a fevered dream. As I stepped out of her apartment and into the crisp morning air, I couldn't help but laugh to myself. It wasn't the date I'd expected, not by a long shot. Walking home, I replayed the night over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of it. There was no making sense of it. Some experiences defy explanation, and this was one of them. If nothing else, it left me with a story I'd never forget, a strange, chaotic glimpse into the unpredictability of dating. And though I'd never see her again, the memory of that bizarre night stayed with me, a reminder of just how wild and unpredictable human connections can be. Sometimes, the best lesson you can take from an experience is knowing when to walk away. My Tinder date and I were a couple of drinks in, the kind of buzz that loosens nerves and makes conversation flow just a little easier. It wasn't the best date I'd ever been on, pleasant enough, but nothing that screamed potential. Still, I thought, why not see where the night goes? We moved to a late-night bar, one of those places that seems to exist in perpetual twilight, filled with people who have no intention of calling it a night anytime soon. The energy shifted slightly. We both got a bit drunker, and the conversation began to lose focus. I could feel the date sliding into the territory of just okay, but I was determined to salvage it. That's when it happened. We were standing near the bar, and I'd turned away for a moment, distracted by something on the screen above. When I looked back, she was leaning in close to some other guy, laughing at something he'd said, her hand lightly brushing his arm. At first, I thought I was imagining it. She's just being friendly, I told myself. But then I noticed the way he leaned in, the way she didn't pull back. I stood there, unsure of what to do. I wasn't expecting exclusivity, we were on a first date, after all, but there was something undeniably disrespectful about it. I gave it a few minutes, hoping she'd catch my eye and realize how awkward this looked, but she didn't. Instead, I saw her pull out her phone and hand it to the guy. He tapped something into it and handed it back. My stomach sank. When she finally returned to me, she was all smiles, as if nothing had happened. "Ready for another drink?" she asked brightly. I hesitated, debating whether to call her out or just let it go. I decided on the latter, though my interest in the date had dwindled to almost nothing. The rest of the night was a blur of small talk and forced smiles, and by the time we said goodbye, I knew there wouldn't be a second date. I thought that would be the end of my Tinder horror stories, but a friend's experience soon topped mine. My mate had also met someone on Tinder, and their date had started out promising. They'd chosen a casual bar, found a cozy table, and settled in for a night of drinks and conversation. Everything seemed to be going well, until he excused himself to use the restroom. When he returned, he found his date was gone. At first, he thought maybe she'd stepped outside or gone to the bathroom herself. But then the guys at the next table leaned over and told him what had really happened. "She went through your jacket," one of them said, nodding toward the coat he'd left draped over the back of his chair. "Checked every pocket before she walked out." He He immediately checked his belongings, his heart racing. Thankfully, he'd kept his wallet and phone in his trouser pockets, but the thought of someone rifling through his things while he was just a few steps away made his skin crawl. He felt humiliated, duped by someone he'd thought was genuinely interested in getting to know him. When he told me the story, his voice was a mix of disbelief and anger. "Who does that?" he asked, shaking his head. "I mean, if you're not feeling the date, just say so. Don't pretend, and then rob me." I nodded, sharing his frustration. Both our experiences, though different, had the same bitter aftertaste. A sense of being blindsided, of realizing too late that the person you'd trusted, even briefly, wasn't who they seemed to be. These kinds of stories stick with you, not just because of the awkwardness or disappointment, but because they remind you of the unpredictability of dating. You step into it hoping for a connection, a spark, maybe even something lasting. Instead, you sometimes find yourself questioning people's motives, wondering if you misread the situation or missed some glaring red flag. For me, that night in the late-night bar was a wake-up call. It reminded me to trust my instincts, to recognize when someone's actions don't align with their words. For my friend, it was a lesson in protecting yourself, even in the smallest ways, never leaving your belongings unattended, even when you think you're in safe company. Dating is a gamble, a strange mix of hope and risk, and not every roll of the dice pays off. But even in the worst moments, there's something to learn, something that makes you more cautious, more aware. And if nothing else, there's always a story to tell. A reminder that even the most awkward, disappointing nights can eventually be laughed about, shared over drinks with friends who've had their fair share of misadventures too. As I walked through the door, I felt a mix of nerves and cautious optimism. First dates were always unpredictable, but I hoped this one would be different. We'd connected online, exchanged messages that were light-hearted and engaging. He seemed intelligent, funny, and thoughtful, exactly the kind of person I was looking for. When he arrived, he was polite, even charming at first. He held the door for me, complimented my outfit, and asked about my day as we were seated. It felt normal, pleasant even. I started to relax, thinking maybe this was the beginning of something promising. But then the conversation shifted. We started talking about university, a topic that inevitably came up when two students met. I told him where I'd gone, feeling proud of the choice I'd made. It wasn't one of the top-tier schools, but it was respected, and I'd worked hard to get there. His reaction, however, was anything but supportive. "Oh," he said, his tone dipping into something condescending. He tilted his head slightly, as if trying to mask his disdain but failing miserably. "That's nice." The way he said it made my stomach tighten. It wasn't the words themselves, but the tone, the unmistakable air of judgment. He might as well have said, "Is that the best you could do?" I tried to shake it off, determined not to let his comment derail the evening. But as the date went on, his true colors began to show. He peppered the conversation with little digs, subtle enough to fly under the radar, but pointed enough to make me feel small. He criticized the food, the service, even the playlist humming softly in the background. It felt like he was trying to elevate himself by tearing everything else down. And then out of nowhere, he dropped a bombshell. We'd somehow wandered into the topic of hobbies, and I was sharing some of mine, reading, photography, hiking, when he interrupted me. "Well, I'm a brony," he said, leaning back in his chair with a smug smile. I blinked, unsure if I'd misheard him. "A what?" "A brony," he repeated, his tone as casual as if he'd just announced he played soccer or enjoyed painting. "You know, guys who are fans of My Little Pony." I stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. Not because being a brony is inherently bad, but because the juxtaposition was jarring. Here was someone who had spent the evening judging me, judging everything, only to reveal that he was an adult man deeply invested in a children's show about pastel ponies. "Oh," I said, my voice neutral, trying not to let my thoughts show on my face. "That's interesting." He took my polite response as an invitation to elaborate. For the next 20 minutes, he waxed poetic about the show's themes of friendship and acceptance, about the brony community, and how misunderstood they were. It wasn't the subject matter that unnerved me. It was the fervor, the sheer intensity with which he spoke. He was more animated, more passionate, than he had been all evening. Meanwhile, I was trapped in an internal tug-of-war between amusement and discomfort. This wasn't just a red flag, it was an entire parade. By the time dessert rolled around, I was exhausted. The meal felt like it had stretched on for hours, each minute a test of my patience. I kept replaying the moment he'd looked down his nose at my university, the casual disdain in his voice, and then contrasted it with his enthusiastic monologue about cartoon ponies. It was all so absurd that I wanted to laugh, but I also wanted to leave. Finally, the check arrived. I didn't wait for him to offer to split it. I just threw down my card, desperate to end the evening as quickly as possible. He looked surprised but didn't argue, which was a small mercy. As we stepped outside, he asked if I wanted to grab a drink somewhere else. I shook my head, forcing a smile. "I think I'm going to call it a night," I said. "Thanks for dinner." He nodded, looking a little disappointed, but didn't press. I walked away, the cool night air refreshing after the suffocating atmosphere of the date. As I got into my car, I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of the evening. The judgment, the unexpected declaration of Brony status, the disconnect between his personality and his hobbies. It was all too much. That night, I made a vow. Never again would I agree to a dinner date as a first meeting. It was too much time, too much commitment for someone you barely knew. A coffee or a drink was fine, quick, casual, with an easy escape route. But a full meal? That was a gamble I wasn't willing to take anymore. Looking back, the experience taught me more than just the value of shorter first dates. It reminded me to trust my instincts, to recognize when someone's words and actions don't align. And while I don't begrudge him his love of My Little Pony, I'll always remember that night as a lesson in knowing when to walk away, and when to laugh about it later. The night started out innocently enough. She had matched with a guy on Tinder a week earlier, their conversations casual and lighthearted. He seemed charming, funny, and maybe a bit rough around the edges, but nothing that set off alarm bells. When he suggested meeting up, she hesitated, but decided to give him a chance. After all, everyone deserves one, right? But nothing could have prepared her for the moment he showed up at her door. When she opened it, her breath hitched. There he was, standing on her porch, a suitcase by his side. He wasn't the confident, laid-back guy she'd been texting. Instead, he was gaunt and jittery, like someone who had been running on fumes for days. And then there was the tattoo, an unmistakable Mike Tyson-style face tattoo sprawled across his cheek. Except he wasn't Mike Tyson. He was a skinny white guy whose presence screamed trouble. Before she could even greet him, he stepped forward, dragging the suitcase into her entryway like he belonged there. "Hey," he said, his voice casual as if this were a normal scenario. "Thanks for letting me crash here. I just got out of prison and didn't have anywhere else to go." Her stomach dropped. Prison? Crash here? She stared at him, her mind racing. This couldn't be real. She hadn't signed up for this, hadn't agreed to let a stranger, freshly released from who knows where, into her home. Her hand tightened on the doorknob, but he was already inside, standing awkwardly in her living room like a misplaced piece of furniture. I think there's been a misunderstanding," she stammered, trying to keep her voice steady. Her instincts screamed at her to get him out, but fear held her frozen in place. She tried to regain control of the situation. "I thought we were just meeting up." He shrugged, completely unfazed. "Yeah, but I figured it'd be easier this way. I didn't have anywhere else to go." She blinked, stunned by his audacity. "I don't think this is going to work," she said firmly, her voice shaking slightly. "You need to leave." But he didn't move. Instead, he sank onto her couch, letting out a long sigh like he'd just found a sanctuary. "It's been a long day," he muttered, rubbing his hands together. "I just need a place to figure things out." Panic bubbled up in her chest. She needed him gone, but every attempt to reason with him was met with nonchalance or outright dismissal. He acted as if this was perfectly normal, as if she were the one being unreasonable. Her mind raced with worst-case scenarios, the what-ifs growing darker with each passing second. Finally, she excused herself to the bathroom, her heart pounding as she locked the door behind her. She pulled out her phone, hands trembling as she dialed the police. Whispering into the receiver, she explained the situation as quickly and clearly as she could. "There's a man in my house," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He won't leave. He just got out of prison, and he brought a suitcase." The operator assured her that help was on the way, and told her to stay on the line. She tried to keep her breathing steady, every sound from the living room making her flinch. He was still there, muttering to himself, the suitcase now open on her floor. She didn't want to think about what could be inside. Minutes felt like hours as she waited, the tension in the air so thick it was suffocating. Finally, a knock at the door shattered the silence. She peeked out from the bathroom and saw the flashing red and blue lights through the front window. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived. As the officers entered, the man stood up, his expression a mix of defiance and resignation. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone casual, as if he hadn't been squatting in a stranger's home uninvited. The officers wasted no time, guiding him out of the house while she stayed back, her body still trembling. One of them stayed behind to take her statement, reassuring her that she'd done the right thing. "You can't be too careful," the officer said. "People like that can be unpredictable." After they left, she stood in the middle of her living room, staring at the space where he'd been. The air still felt heavy, the tension lingering even in his absence. She locked the door, triple-checking it before collapsing onto her bed, the adrenaline finally draining from her system. She deleted Tinder the next day, vowing never to trust anyone online so easily again. It wasn't just about him. It was about the stark realization of how quickly things could spiral out of control, how a simple swipe could lead to a situation that felt like something out of a nightmare. In the weeks that followed, she told the story to a few close friends, each retelling met with gasps and disbelief. "A suitcase," one of them asked wide-eyed. "And a face tattoo?" She nodded, laughing now that the fear had faded, but the lesson stuck with her. Trust wasn't something to be handed out freely, and boundaries weren't just a guideline, they were a necessity. The experience left her shaken, yes, but also stronger, more cautious, and far more aware of how quickly a seemingly normal situation could turn into anything but. The restaurant was warm and inviting, its air filled with the savory scent of teriyaki and the quiet clinking of chopsticks against ceramic plates. It was the kind of place that made you feel sophisticated just by being there. I sat across from him, a guy I'd met online, my nerves buzzing like static electricity. He was polite, handsome in an understated way, and he seemed easygoing, at least at first. When the server brought our menus, I immediately noticed the chopsticks. My stomach sank a little. I'd never been great with them. Sure, I could clumsily poke at my food and hope for the best, but I wasn't confident. I smiled nervously, holding the wooden sticks in my hand like they might snap. "Do you think I should just ask for a fork?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. His reaction was immediate, his face tightening with visible disapproval. "No," he said, his voice clipped. "It's so embarrassing when people do that. Just try the chopsticks. You'll get the hang of it." The words stung, but I nodded, determined not to let his reaction ruin the night. If he thought I could manage, then I would. I steeled myself, gripping the chopsticks with exaggerated focus. The first few minutes were a struggle, but I soldiered on, desperate to prove I wasn't the kind of person to embarrass him in public. And then it happened. I went to pick up a piece of sushi, small, harmless, manageable. Or so I thought. The chopsticks slipped in my hand, and in what felt like slow motion, a sizable chunk of wasabi launched into the air. For a split second, I watched it arc gracefully across the table before landing squarely in his eye. Time seemed to stop. His hand shot to his face, and he let out a strangled gasp, the kind of sound you might make if someone had just thrown pepper spray at you. My stomach plummeted. "Oh my God!" I blurted, my voice a mix of horror and panic. "Are you okay?" He didn't answer. Instead, he bolted for the bathroom, his chair scraping loudly against the floor as several heads turned to watch. I sat there, frozen, mortified, and utterly unsure of what to do. The server approached with a concerned look, and all I could do was stammer an apology, unsure if it was meant for her or for the guy I'd just assaulted with wasabi. Minutes dragged by, each one stretching into what felt like an eternity. He eventually returned, his face red and blotchy, his left eye bloodshot and watering profusely. He looked less like the polished, easygoing guy I'd sat down with, and more like a very angry, very wounded pirate. "I am so sorry," I said again, my voice trembling as I reached for my wallet. "Please let me pay for the meal." He waved a hand dismissively, his other hand still clutching a napkin to his eye. "Let's just get through this," he muttered. The rest of the date was an exercise in awkwardness. Every attempt at conversation fizzled out within seconds, my words faltering under the weight of my guilt and his obvious discomfort. He spent most of the time dabbing at his eye, wincing periodically, while I avoided eye contact altogether. By the time the check came, I insisted on paying. It felt like the least I could do after turning what was supposed to be a pleasant evening into a comedy of errors. He didn't argue, which only made me feel worse. As we stepped outside, the cold air hit me like a slap. "Thank you for dinner," he said stiffly, his tone flat. "Have a good night." "You too," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned and walked away without looking back, and I stood there for a moment, the humiliation washing over me in waves. I'd never felt so mortified in my life. The next day, I replayed the date over and over in my mind, each detail more excruciating than the last. The wasabi, the bathroom, his bloodshot eye, it was all burned into my memory. I kept checking my phone, half expecting a text, but deep down I knew better. There was no way he'd want a second date, and he didn't. Looking back, the experience taught me two things. First, practice your chopstick skills before attempting sushi on a date. Second, and more importantly, some things are just out of your control. You can plan, prepare, and try your best to make a good impression, but sometimes life, or a rogue piece of wasabi, has other plans. Though it took time, I've learned to laugh about it. It's become one of those stories you tell at parties, the kind that gets better with each retelling. And while I haven't mastered chopsticks since, I've mastered something far more important. The ability to laugh at myself, even when things go horribly, hilariously wrong. I sat there, nervously stirring my coffee, glancing at the door every few seconds. This was a blind date, arranged by a mutual friend who swore we'd hit it off. I was skeptical but curious. She was Norwegian, my friend had said, confident, intelligent, and charming. A fresh face in Prague's tight-knit expat community. When she walked in, the world seemed to pause for a moment. She was striking, with an effortless elegance that made the rest of the cafe seem dim in comparison. She spotted me, and I waved, feeling a strange mix of excitement and anxiety. This could be the start of something, I thought. I stood to greet her, and she smiled politely, though there was a guardedness in her expression that I chalked up to first-date nerves. We eased into conversation. She was witty and sharp, her English flawless. I was doing my best to keep up, to appear as interesting as she seemed. We talked about Prague, the quirks of living abroad, the strange camaraderie that forms among expats. She seemed engaged, though not overly warm. Still, I felt like the date was going fine, until I mentioned my Norwegian friend. It was an innocent comment, the kind of thing you say when you're trying to build rapport. Oh, you're Norwegian? That's cool. I actually have a Norwegian friend here in Prague. Do you happen to know him? As soon as the words left my mouth, I saw her freeze. Her smile evaporated, replaced by a look I couldn't quite read. Was it shock? Disgust? Annoyance? She stared at me, her eyes narrowing slightly, and the air between us grew heavy. I laughed nervously, unsure of what I'd said wrong. I mean, I know it's a big country, but the expat circles here seem pretty small. She didn't let me finish. Without a word, she pushed her chair back, stood up, grabbed her coat, and walked out. No explanation, no goodbye, not even a glance back. Just gone. I sat there, stunned, the silence at our table deafening against the backdrop of the bustling cafe. My first thought was that I'd offended her somehow, though I couldn't figure out how. My mind raced, replaying the conversation, trying to pinpoint where it had gone wrong. I felt a flush of embarrassment creep up my neck as the reality of what had just happened sank in. When I finally left the cafe, still bewildered, I decided to text my Norwegian friend. He was one of those people who seemed to know everyone in Prague, and if anyone could shed light on what had happened, it was him. Hey, weird question, I wrote. Do you know a Norwegian woman, tall, blonde, kind of intense? I think her name is Elise, or something like that. The reply came almost immediately. Yeah, why? I hesitated before typing back. She just stormed out of a blind date with me after I mentioned you. Any idea why? There was a long pause before his next message arrived, and when it did, I could almost hear the sheepish tone through the screen. Ah, yeah, that might be my fault. We hooked up last week. My stomach sank. Of course. The world of expats in Prague wasn't just small, it was microscopic. What were the odds that the one person I'd bring up in conversation was the very reason she'd left? I felt equal parts frustrated and humiliated. No wonder she'd reacted the way she had. To her, I probably seemed like some kind of accomplice to a bad joke. I told my friend as much, and he laughed. Bad luck, mate. Didn't mean to sabotage you. His response only made me more annoyed. You could have warned me, I shot back. This whole thing was awkward enough without her thinking I was rubbing salt in the wound. The conversation ended there, but the experience stuck with me. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop replaying the moment she'd walked out, the look on her face, the way she'd left without a word. I wondered if I should have handled it differently, if I should have apologized or explained myself. But what could I have said that wouldn't make things worse? In the end, it became one of those stories I told with a mix of embarrassment and humor. A cautionary tale about the perils of dating in a small, interconnected community. It wasn't the first time Prague's tight-knit expat circles had led to an awkward encounter, and it probably wouldn't be the last. Still, the lesson was clear. Tread carefully, especially when mentioning mutual acquaintances. Because in a city like Prague, you never know who's already crossed paths, and how much history might be lingering beneath the surface. The sound of tires idling in the driveway hummed through the evening air, blending with the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. I'd been pacing near the window for the past 10 minutes, my nerves wound tight. It wasn't just the date, though that was pressure enough. It was the added tension of dealing with my dad. He always had a knack for making things awkward, but tonight I prayed he'd give me a break. Then my phone buzzed in my hand. It was her. "Hey, I'm outside," she said, her voice tinged with unease. "Can you come out? I don't really want to meet your dad." I couldn't blame her. My dad was the type to crack jokes that skirted the edge of comfort, always leaning into his role as the overprotective father. I reassured her and told her I'd be right out. As I hung up, I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door, keeping my movements casual to avoid attracting his attention. But as luck would have it, the creak of the old hinges gave me away. He looked up from the couch, his brows furrowing. "Where are you going?" he asked, setting down his beer. "Out," I replied quickly, hoping that would suffice. "With who?" The words hung in the air, the weight of his curiosity suffocating. I hesitated, glancing toward the door. "Just someone." He stood up, stretching dramatically, a mischievous grin already forming on his face. "Oh, just someone, huh? I think I'd better come see who this someone is." I groaned internally, trying to keep my voice steady. "Dad, it's fine. I'll be back later." But he wasn't listening. He followed me out the front door, his expression practically gleeful. There she was, waiting in the driveway, her car idling, headlights cutting through the twilight. I could see her silhouette through the windshield, her phone in her hand as she fidgeted nervously. When my dad spotted her, his grin widened. "Oh, this is gonna be good," he muttered under his breath. "Dad," I hissed, panic rising in my chest. "Don't." But it was too late. The moment I stepped off the porch, he pounced. "Where do you think you're going?" he barked, his voice loud enough to echo down the street. Before I could respond, he tackled me to the ground, his weight knocking the wind out of me as we hit the grass. "Dad, what the hell?" I sputtered, trying to push him off, but he was already rolling into his performance. He grabbed me by the collar, his expression exaggeratedly stern, and pretended to throw punches, his fists stopping just short of my face. "You think you're gonna sneak out with some girl without telling me?" he yelled, his voice dripping with mock fury. "Not on my watch." I heard the rev of her engine, the unmistakable crunch of gravel as her car backed out of the driveway. My heart sank. "Dad, stop," I shouted, struggling beneath him. "She's leaving." But he was too caught up in his own joke, laughing as he pretended to deliver one last blow. Finally, he got off me, dusting off his hands with a satisfied smirk. "There," he said, grinning. "That ought to keep her on her toes." I scrambled to my feet, my chest tight with frustration and humiliation. The red glow of her taillights disappeared around the corner, leaving nothing but the dull hum of crickets in the air. "Are you kidding me?" I snapped, brushing dirt off my clothes. "What?" he said, feigning innocence. "I was just messing around. That wasn't funny." I shot back, my voice cracking under the weight of my anger. "She thought you were serious." "She's gone, Dad. You scared her off." He hesitated then, his grin faltering slightly as he realized what he'd done. But instead of apologizing, he chuckled and clapped me on the shoulder. "If she can't handle a little fun, she's not the one for you, kid." I stared at him, incredulous. "Are you serious right now?" He shrugged, turning back toward the house. "You'll thank me one day." I watched him disappear inside, the screen door creaking shut behind him. The adrenaline from his so-called prank began to wear off, replaced by a heavy sense of defeat. I pulled out my phone, staring at her name in my messages. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but what could I say? "Hey, sorry about my psycho dad. Please come back." I sighed, sliding the phone back into my pocket. There was no salvaging this. She hadn't even given me a chance to explain. I imagined her racing home, telling her friends about the insane dad who'd ambushed her date on the lawn. The walk back to the house felt like a walk of shame, every step heavier than the last. By the time I reached my room, the frustration had settled into something quieter, a mix of embarrassment and resignation. The next day, I tried texting her. Once. Twice. No response. By the third attempt, I gave up. She was gone, and I couldn't blame her. My dad's antics had ruined any chance I might have had, and I was left with nothing but the memory of his ridiculous laugh and the feel of grass still clinging to my jeans. It was a hard lesson, one I wouldn't forget. Not everyone finds your family's sense of humor endearing. And sometimes, their jokes cost you more than you're willing to pay. It was supposed to be a laid-back lunch, nothing fancy, but I'd still put in the effort. Light makeup, a casual yet stylish outfit, hair neatly tied back. First impressions matter, after all. I was hungry and hopeful, eager to see if this online match could turn into something more. When I arrived, I glanced around, half expecting to see him waiting. He wasn't. A quick check of my phone revealed no new messages, so I sat at a table and sent a polite text. "Hey, I'm here. What's your ETA?" His reply came minutes later, running late. "About 30 minutes. Just start eating without me if you're hungry." I frowned at my screen, annoyance bubbling up. 30 minutes? On a first date? The thought of leaving crossed my mind, but hunger won the internal debate. I ordered something small to tide me over and distracted myself with my phone while the minutes ticked by. As time dragged on, I told myself he'd probably apologize profusely when he arrived. Everyone gets delayed sometimes, right? Maybe this could still turn out okay. And then he walked in. The moment I saw him, I froze, my fork hovering in midair. He looked like he'd just rolled out of bed, literally. His hair was a tangled mess, sticking out in every direction like a bird had built its nest there. He wore an old, faded event t-shirt, baggy shorts that resembled pajamas, and a pair of worn-out slippers. His posture was relaxed, his expression cheerful, and there wasn't a hint of apology in his demeanor. "Hey," he chirped, sliding into the chair across from me, completely unbothered by the fact that he was over half an hour late. I couldn't believe it. No apology, no acknowledgement of the time, no sign that he'd even tried to make himself presentable. The irritation I'd been suppressing erupted into disbelief. This wasn't just casual, this was disrespectful. I'd spent time preparing for this date, and he couldn't even be bothered to brush his hair or wear actual shoes. As he opened the menu, I stared at him, my appetite evaporating. He hummed to himself, completely oblivious to the tension building across the table. "So what's good here?" he asked, flashing me a toothy grin. I didn't answer. My mind was already made up. There was no salvaging this. "You know," I said, trying to keep my voice even, "I'm actually feeling pretty tired. I think I'm going to head home." His face faltered for a split second, but he quickly masked it with another overly casual shrug. "Oh, okay. Well, no worries." I stood up, grabbing my bag. If I'd felt any guilt about leaving him sitting there, it vanished the moment I remembered his lateness, his disheveled appearance, and his lack of basic courtesy. He didn't even seem fazed as I walked away. Once I was out of sight, I let out a deep sigh of relief. The date had barely started, but it was already one of the worst I'd ever experienced. I pulled out my phone, blocked his number, and kept walking, grateful to leave that mess behind me. As I replayed the disaster in my mind, a mix of emotions swirled within me. Annoyance, disappointment, and embarrassment danced together, but one thought stood out. How did I not see this coming? I'd gone into the date thinking that someone who wasn't conventionally attractive might put more effort into their behavior, their courtesy, their presentation. I'd assumed they'd understand the importance of making a good impression. But clearly I'd been wrong. His actions, or lack thereof, spoke volumes. It wasn't about looks. It was about effort, respect, and the simple decency of valuing someone else's time. And he'd shown none of that. By the time I got home, my irritation had subsided into something softer, acceptance. It was a lesson learned, a reminder not to lower my expectations or settle for the bare minimum just because someone seemed nice in text conversations. If they couldn't show respect in person, then they weren't worth my time. That night, I told my friends the story, complete with dramatic reenactments of his entrance and my walkout. They laughed until tears rolled down their faces, and soon I was laughing too. The experience had been frustrating, yes, but in hindsight, it was absurd enough to be funny. The next time I went on a date, I made sure to set my expectations higher, not in terms of looks, but in terms of effort and respect. Because if there's one thing I learned from that disheveled, chirpy guy with his bird's nest hair and oblivious smile, it's this. The way someone shows up for you says everything about how much they value you. And I deserved someone who'd show up ready to match my energy, not just roll out of bed and hope for the best. Dating, they said, was supposed to be an adventure. What they didn't tell me was that sometimes That adventure felt more like a slow-motion car crash, one bizarre twist after another. Each experience brought its own lesson, or at least its own baffling story. But there were three that stood out like the plot of a fever dream. The first story started off promising enough. She was smart, confident, and carried herself with an air of independence. It was the kind of energy that drew me in, making me think, this could actually work. Our first date went smoothly, and over the next few weeks, we met for dinners, drinks, and the occasional movie. Things seemed to be falling into place, until the night it all unraveled. We'd planned dinner at a cozy little spot not far from her office. It was 5 minutes, maybe less, from where she worked, and I assumed we'd meet there. But as I was heading to the restaurant, my phone buzzed. Her text was curt, almost accusatory. "Are you not going to pick me up from my office?" I stared at the message, confused. Her office was literally around the corner. When I explained I was already at the restaurant and had assumed she'd walk over, her response was cold. She showed up with a frosty demeanor that lingered through the entire meal. That wasn't the end of it. Despite her insistence on splitting the bill on every date, she later dumped me after our 5th outing, citing the fact that I'd never fought her for the bill. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd respected her independence, only to be criticized for it. The entire thing left me scratching my head, wondering if I'd missed some unspoken rule of modern dating etiquette. Then there was the lunch date that spiraled into something I can only describe as surreal. It started innocently enough, good food, light conversation, and the usual back and forth about hobbies and interests. As we finished our meal and stepped out into the sunshine, she grabbed my arm and tugged me toward a nearby store. I glanced up at the sign, Furla. I'd barely processed what was happening when we were inside, surrounded by glossy shelves lined with designer handbags. She glided through the displays with purpose, occasionally glancing back to see if I was following. Finally, she stopped in front of a sleek black bag, picked it up, and turned to face me. "This one's nice," she said, her tone casual but pointed. She held the bag out slightly, as if waiting for me to take it. I laughed nervously, unsure of what she was expecting. "Yeah, it's a nice bag," I replied, trying to steer the conversation back to neutral ground. Her smile faltered. She placed the bag back on the shelf, her disappointment palpable. The energy shifted after that, the rest of the afternoon tinged with an awkwardness I couldn't quite shake. I walked away from that date more puzzled than anything else, wondering if she genuinely expected me to buy her a designer bag after one lunch. But the strangest date of all happened in the most unassuming setting, a coffee shop. It was a first date, casual and low pressure. She was charming in the way people sometimes are when they're just a little too confident, and our conversation flowed easily, at least at first. Then out of nowhere, she steered the topic into a very unexpected direction. "So," she said, stirring her latte, "what kind of kinks are you into?" I nearly choked on my coffee. I stammered, caught completely off guard. "I'm not sure that's first date material." She grinned, leaning in as if she were about to share a juicy secret. "Well, I'll go first," she said, her tone nonchalant. "I like being slapped. Hard. Like full force across the face." The coffee shop suddenly felt a lot smaller. I froze, unsure how to respond. She must have noticed my discomfort because she kept talking, filling the silence with a story that made my stomach churn. "It's probably because of my dad," she said casually. "He used to do it to me when I was a kid. Guess it stuck." I stared at her, trying to decide if I was being trolled or if this was some kind of dark confession disguised as banter. Her expression didn't give anything away. She seemed completely unbothered, sipping her coffee like we were discussing weekend plans. The date ended shortly after, and I walked out of the coffee shop feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. To this day, I still don't know if she was being honest, trying to shock me, or just testing how far she could push the boundaries of first date conversation. Whatever her intent, it was a date I'd never forget, and not for the right reasons. Each of these dates left me with more questions than answers. Was I missing some critical piece of the puzzle, or was modern dating just a minefield of unspoken rules and outlandish expectations? I thought about quitting altogether, retreating into the safety of single life, where at least I didn't have to navigate these bizarre encounters. But with time, I learned to laugh about it. These stories became the kind of thing you share with friends over drinks, each retelling more exaggerated than the last. And while they didn't lead to love, they left me with something just as valuable. A treasure trove of memories, proof that the road to connection is as unpredictable as it is absurd. I had matched with her on Tinder, her profile boasting a polished smile and a spark in her eyes that had intrigued me. We'd exchanged a few pleasant messages, and everything seemed promising enough. But when I arrived, my stomach dropped. She looked nothing like her photos. It wasn't just the slight differences filters can bring. It was an entirely different person. I considered turning around and leaving, but politeness won out. "You're already here," I told myself. "At least enjoy the meal and make it through the evening." I greeted her, doing my best to mask my surprise, and we settled into our seats. The initial awkwardness faded as we made small talk, and soon the conversation turned to the inevitable first date topic: why we were on Tinder. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping as if to share a juicy secret. "I had a bad breakup recently," she began, shaking her head. "Turns out my boyfriend's girlfriend called me to tell me that my boyfriend was actually married." I blinked, trying to process her words. "Wait," I said carefully, "your boyfriend had a girlfriend and a wife?" She nodded solemnly, like someone recounting a tragic but oddly rehearsed story. "Yeah, I had no idea though. He seemed so young, so put together. It never crossed my mind." Intrigued despite myself, I asked, "How old was he?" Her expression shifted slightly, as if bracing for judgment. 50, she said, then added quickly, "but he looked way younger." I raised an eyebrow. "Do you have a picture of him?" She reached for her phone, scrolling through her gallery before holding it out to me. The man in the photo was clearly pushing 60, his weathered face and graying hair telling a story that didn't quite align with her description. My mind reeled. Between the revelation of her ex's double life and the odd gaps in her perception of reality, it was all starting to feel too much. I decided then and there to cut my losses. This wasn't just a bad date, it was a minefield of drama, and I had no intention of stepping further into it. "Listen," I said, leaning back in my chair, "I appreciate you coming out tonight, but I don't think this is going to work. I don't want to waste your time, so I'd rather be honest." She blinked, taken aback, but nodded slowly. "Okay," she said, her tone neutral. I paid the bill, standing up and thanking her for the evening. As I left, I expected her to stay behind, perhaps finishing her drink or calling a friend. Instead, I realized she was walking alongside me toward the street. "So," she asked a little too casually, "where am I going?" I stopped in my tracks, staring at her. "I'm going to my home," I said, signaling with my hands to emphasize the growing distance. "And you're going to your home." She paused for a moment, her expression unreadable, before nodding. "Okay," she said, her tone a little too cheerful for someone who'd just been turned down. I flagged my ride and headed home, relieved to leave the strangeness of the night behind me. Or so I thought. The next morning, the doorbell rang. Groggily, I checked my video feed, expecting a delivery or a neighbor. Instead, there she was, standing on my porch, visibly upset. "What the?" I muttered, staring at the screen in disbelief. Through the video feed, she began shouting, "Why didn't you text me? Why didn't you want to see me again?" I stared at her, stunned. How had she even found my address? Then it clicked. My home doubled as my office, and the address was listed on my website. Taking a deep breath, I pressed the intercom. "I was clear last night," I said, my voice firm. "We're not seeing each other again." She started crying, her voice rising as she tried to argue, but I cut the connection, turning off the feed. My heart pounded as I stood there, waiting for her to leave. After a few minutes, the silence returned. I checked the feed again. She was gone. For days, I half expected her to show up again, but she never did. The incident faded into a strange, almost surreal memory, a cautionary tale I'd recount to friends over beers. I deleted the app for a while, swearing off dating altogether. But 2 months later, I decided to give Tinder one last try. That's when I met her, my now wife. She was everything the previous date wasn't: grounded, kind, and effortlessly funny. We hit it off immediately, and within weeks, we knew we had something special. Looking back, that bizarre evening at the restaurant feels like a distant nightmare, a strange detour on the path to something far better. The drama, the awkwardness, the uninvited visit to my home, it all became just another story, one that makes me appreciate the stability and love I have now. Tinder may be a minefield, but sometimes, if you're lucky, it leads you exactly where you're meant to be. The bustling city street was alive with energy, packed with pedestrians weaving in and out of each other's paths, the hum of conversations and car horns creating an urban symphony. I was navigating the crowd, focused on not bumping into anyone, when I felt him at my side. My first date with this guy, arranged through a mutual friend, had barely started. We were on our way to a cafe I'd suggested, and while we'd exchanged polite texts before meeting, I'd had no warning for what was about to unfold. 10 minutes into the walk, he abruptly stopped mid-stride and glared at me. His voice, sharp and loud enough to cut through the noise around us, caught me off guard. "Are you seriously checking out other guys in front of me?" he demanded. I blinked, taken aback. "What? No, I'm just—" "You think I didn't notice?" he interrupted, his voice rising. "Your head's on a swivel, ogling every guy that passes." My stomach dropped, not because I'd done what he accused me of, I hadn't, but because I realized this wasn't going to be the light-hearted first date I'd hoped for. "I'm just trying not to bump into anyone," I said, gesturing to the sea of people around us. He scoffed, shaking his head. "Yeah, right. Let me tell you something. Being a hoe is a bad life decision." His words hit like a slap, the venom in his tone leaving me momentarily speechless. This wasn't some awkward misunderstanding. This was hostility, pure and unfiltered, hurled at me on what was supposed to be a simple coffee date. I felt my pulse quicken, my hands tightening into fists as a surge of indignation rushed through me. "Excuse me?" I said, my voice calm but firm, refusing to let him rattle me. He ignored my question, launching into a tirade about respect, loyalty, and how women like me were doomed to end up alone. All this, mind you, within 15 minutes of meeting me. The sheer audacity of his assumptions and accusations was staggering. People on the street glanced in our direction, sensing the tension, but I barely noticed. My focus narrowed on one goal, getting out of this nightmare. Without another word, I pulled out my phone and texted my friend who worked nearby. "SOS. Having a terrible date. Coming to see you." As I walked away, his voice followed me, louder and angrier. "You'll never find someone better than me," he shouted, his words laced with bitterness. "Good luck being single forever." I didn't look back. The cafe I'd suggested faded into irrelevance. Instead, I ducked into a Starbucks and bought 2 drinks, my hands still shaking as I handed over my card. The entire encounter played on a loop in my head, disbelief mingling with anger. How had someone thought this man was a good match for me? How had I ended up here? Drinks in hand, I headed to my friend's workplace. When I walked in, she looked up, her face breaking into a surprised smile. "What are you doing here?" "Long story," I said, handing her the coffee. "Let's just say you're saving me from the worst date of my life." As I recounted the incident, her expression shifted from shock to fury. "Who even acts like that?" she said, her voice rising. "That's completely unhinged." "Tell me about it," I muttered. I blocked him the second I walked away. "And the person who set us up? They're blocked too." We laughed about it then, the kind of laughter that comes from sheer relief at dodging a bullet. Sitting there with my friend, surrounded by the comforting buzz of her workplace, I felt the tension in my chest begin to ease. The date, ridiculous as it had been, was over. I was safe, and I'd learned something valuable. Red flags don't always wave subtly. Sometimes they slap you in the face and yell at you in public. The whole experience left me wary of setups and dates for a while. It wasn't just the man's outburst that unnerved me. It was the sheer speed with which he'd revealed his true colors. There had been no slow unraveling, no gradual realization that we weren't compatible. It had been instant, a neon sign flashing run from the moment he opened his mouth. But as terrible as it was, the incident gave me a story I'd carry with me, a reminder of what I wouldn't tolerate. Respect, I realized, was non-negotiable. And any man who couldn't extend that courtesy on a first date wasn't worth my time, my energy, or even the breath it took to say goodbye. As I walked into the restaurant, I spotted him waiting at a corner table, his confident smirk already on display. He waved me over, and I felt a flicker of hope that this bumble date might turn out well. But it didn't take long for the facade to crack. From the moment I sat down, he was all bravado. Every word that left his mouth dripped with arrogance as he launched into a monologue about his life. He wasn't just confident, he was cocky, and not in the charming way some people can pull off. He bragged about his career, his gym routine, even the specs of his car. It was like he was trying to brand himself as the ultimate alpha male, as if his identity depended on proving he was the most impressive person in the room. I tried to steer the conversation into more neutral, relatable territory, hobbies, favorite movies, anything, but he kept circling back to himself. My patience was already wearing thin when the bill arrived. It was over $250. Now, I'd only had one main and a pint, totaling about $60. The rest? 6 pints of Guinness, his order. I didn't bat an eye at the cost. I'd planned to pay for my share. But then he did something that made my face burn with secondhand embarrassment. With the waitress standing right beside us, he leaned back in his chair and announced loudly, "Wow, restaurants love me, man, because I spend so much money." I froze, cringing as the poor waitress gave him a tight, awkward smile. The sheer lack of self-awareness was astounding. I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Can you just stop?" I hissed, my voice low but sharp. Then I glanced at her and mouthed, "I'm so sorry." He either didn't notice or didn't care about my reaction. He paid the bill with a flourish, still basking in his self-proclaimed generosity. As we stood to leave, I prayed the night would somehow salvage itself. But instead, he walked directly into a glass door, his bravado colliding with reality in the most literal way possible. The sound of the impact echoed in the entryway, and I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. He recovered quickly, brushing it off with a forced chuckle, but the second-hand embarrassment was so thick I could feel it in my bones. We stepped outside to book our rides home, and I thought the ordeal might finally be over. Then he lit a cigarette, taking a long drag before turning to me. "You smoke?" he asked. "No," I said firmly. "I quit." He didn't seem to hear me. Instead, he held the cigarette toward my mouth, insisting, "I just smoke la. You're gonna start again eventually." I recoiled, pushing his hand away. "No thanks," I said, my voice colder now. I wasn't about to let him pressure me into something I'd worked hard to leave behind. Undeterred, he switched gears. "You know where I stay?" he asked casually, like we were old friends. I shrugged, trying to keep things civil. "East Side, right? That's what your profile said." He grinned, puffing his chest out. "I stay in Juchayat. You know where that is? All the landed houses." His phrasing was so blatantly smug that I couldn't help but laugh. Not with him, at him. The audacity was unreal. Who says that on a first date? Who says that ever? Still, he wasn't done. As we waited for our respective rides, he leaned in, desperation creeping into his voice. "You sure you don't want to come back with me?" he asked, his tone turning suggestive. "I'm not interested," I said firmly, for what felt like the fifth time that night. "I'm not looking for casual sex." Instead of respecting my boundaries, he leaned back with a sleazy grin. "Fine," he said, his voice dripping with something vile. "I'm gonna jerk off so hard when I get home, thinking about you." I stared at him, too disgusted to respond. There are moments in life where you wonder how someone could possibly think their behavior is acceptable. This was one of those moments. When my ride finally arrived, I didn't even bother with a goodbye. I climbed in, closed the door, and breathed a sigh of relief as the car pulled away. I didn't wait until I got home to block him. I did it right then and there, deleting any trace of his existence from my phone. Then I blocked the friend who had set us up, ensuring this kind of disaster wouldn't happen again. By the time I reached home, the absurdity of the evening started to sink in. I replayed his antics, the bragging, the glass door, the cigarette, the audacious comments, and found myself laughing out loud. It was so ridiculous it almost felt like a bad sitcom episode. The digital glow of my phone's screen lit up my room as I swiped through the dating app, each profile blending into the next. Then her profile caught my eye. She seemed witty, sharp, and her bio hinted at a playful sense of humor. Our chat started light, filled with jokes and teasing, and I thought we hit it off. Over the course of a week, the conversation flowed effortlessly, online at least. By the time we decided to meet in person, I felt optimistic. This could be the start of something good. Or so I thought. We agreed on a casual restaurant for dinner. When I arrived, she was already there, scrolling through her phone. I greeted her with a smile, and she glanced up briefly before returning to her screen. That should have been the first warning sign, but I brushed it off. Maybe she was nervous or distracted. As we sat down, I did my best to steer the conversation into something engaging. "So, what's your favorite thing to do on weekends?" I asked, starting with an easy topic. She shrugged. "Nothing much." "Okay, maybe hobbies weren't her thing. What about your job? Do you like what you do?" Another shrug. "It's all right." Her responses were lukewarm at best, disinterested at worst. I pushed on, determined to salvage the date. "Any fun plans coming up? Maybe a trip or something you're excited about?" "Not really," she said flatly, her tone making it clear she couldn't care less. It was like talking to a brick wall. No worse, a brick wall might have had more personality. Then she turned the tables. "How much do you make?" she asked abruptly, her eyes suddenly sharp with interest. The question hit like a jolt. I'm not really comfortable talking about my salary on a first date," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. Her expression soured. "Share only what cannot ice it," she said, her words tinged with annoyance. That was when the red flags started waving furiously in my mind. I stayed calm, though inwardly I was certain this wasn't going anywhere. "It's not about whether I can or can't," I said evenly. "I just think it's a personal thing to discuss with someone I barely know." Her response was a dismissive scoff. "Fine lore. If cannot share, then no date." I blinked, stunned by the audacity. The polite thing to do would have been to pivot the conversation, but she doubled down. Her tone was sharp, her words dripping with entitlement. Still, I held my ground, refusing to let the situation escalate. At that point, I knew we weren't compatible, but curiosity got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I showed her a vague breakdown of my last paycheck, not because I wanted to impress her, but because I wanted to see where this would go. As expected, her demeanor changed instantly. "Oh wah, so high pay ah," she said, her tone shifting to one of thinly veiled greed. The glint in her eyes was unmistakable. From that point on, the energy shifted entirely. She demanded that I pay for her meal, arguing that someone with my salary should cover it without question. It was less a request and more an expectation, the kind of attitude that grated on my nerves. I calmly told her I'd cover my portion of the bill because, in my mind, this wasn't a date anymore. It was a transaction, and not one I'd agreed to. "Wait, you're not going to pay for mine?" she asked, her voice rising in indignation. "No," I said firmly, placing $25 on the table for my meal. "This isn't a date anymore." Her reaction was a mix of disbelief and irritation, but I wasn't about to let her guilt me into paying for something she clearly saw as a one-sided affair. I stood up, thanked her for the evening, more out of habit than sincerity, and left the restaurant. As I walked home, the evening replayed in my mind, each moment a lesson in recognizing red flags early. The online connection, so easy and engaging, had been nothing more than a facade. In person, she was uninterested, transactional, and entitled, and I'd wasted an evening trying to engage with someone who clearly wasn't worth the effort. Still, I didn't leave the date angry. Disappointed? Sure. Frustrated? A little. But mostly I was relieved. Relieved that I had trusted my instincts and drawn a line when things crossed into uncomfortable territory. Relieved that I hadn't caved to her demands. And relieved that I'd learned something about setting boundaries, because if there's one thing this date taught me, it's that no connection, no matter how promising it seems online, is worth compromising your self-respect. As I climbed into bed that night, I deleted her number and muted the friend who'd encouraged me to meet her. Some people might see the evening as a disaster, but I saw it differently. It was a reminder that while dating can be messy and unpredictable, it's also a chance to learn more about what you want, and more importantly, what you won't tolerate. The excitement was palpable as I made my way to the restaurant. A week of non-stop, magnetic conversation had built up my expectations for this date. We'd been texting all day and night, diving deep into topics that ranged from favorite childhood memories to future dreams. It felt effortless, like I'd stumbled upon someone who truly understood me. My nerves were electric, but I was hopeful. This was going to be something special, or so I thought. As I approached the restaurant, I saw him waving from inside. I smiled, waved back, and walked in. He looked just as he did in his photos, but something felt slightly off. He didn't stand to greet me or make eye contact. Instead, he kept his gaze locked on the menu, as though it held the answers to the mysteries of the universe. I brushed it off, chalking it up to nerves, and took my seat. The air between us felt strange, almost awkward, but I soldiered on. As I scanned the menu, my stomach sank. It wasn't a halal restaurant. I cursed myself internally for assuming it would be. Trying to keep things smooth, I chose the sole vegetarian option, a risotto, and requested they leave out the wine. The waitress nodded politely, accommodating my request without fuss. Then came the kicker. He ordered a bottle of wine. "Share this with me," he said, flashing what I assumed was his version of a charming grin. I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "Oh no thanks. I'm good with water." He shrugged, poured himself a glass, and began sipping as though he hadn't heard me. As the wine flowed, so did his inhibitions, or rather, his lack of decency. At one point, he called the waitress a bitch for not smiling enough. My jaw tightened. Sure, she wasn't particularly bubbly, but why on earth did that matter? His entitlement radiated like a neon sign, but I bit my tongue, not wanting to escalate the situation. Trying to salvage the evening, I suggested we play one of the restaurant's get-to-know-each-other games. At first, it seemed to lighten the mood, but then he began dissecting every answer I gave, rephrasing questions to nudge me toward answers that aligned with his preferences. My patience wore thin. He rambled on about his experiences with drugs, describing them with an almost nostalgic affection. Then, mid-swig from his wine glass, he launched into a story about his ex. She didn't want to raise our future kids as Muslims, he said, the irony lost on him as he downed another gulp. I just nodded, unsure how to respond. As the restaurant neared closing time, we decided to go for a walk. I hoped the fresh air would clear some of the tension. Instead, he grabbed the wine bottle to take with him, ignoring my raised eyebrow. Outside, he lit a cigarette and excused himself for a quick work call. I agreed, sitting on a nearby bench as he walked a short distance away. He placed the wine bottle next to me before stepping away, leaving me awkwardly stationed with his leftovers. As I waited, a group of elderly women passed by, glaring at me with disapproval. The weight of their judgment made me squirm, and I stood up, putting distance between myself and the bottle. When he returned, he immediately noticed. "Why'd you leave the bottle alone?" he asked, as though I'd committed some unspoken offense. I said nothing, sitting back down out of sheer exhaustion. Then out of nowhere, he pulled out a vape pen, took a deep puff, and blew the smoke directly into my face. My eyes stung, and I coughed, but he just laughed. "Oops," he said, smirking. "Accident." That was the moment I realized I was done. No more excuses, no more trying to smooth over his behavior. He leaned back, glancing at me with a mix of amusement and disdain. "You're not really my type, anyway," he said offhandedly. "Too goody two-shoes for me." I blinked, stunned by his audacity, but I refused to let him see how angry I was. Without a word, I pulled out my phone, booked a grab, and stood up. "I'm heading home," I said, my tone as flat as I could make it. He didn't argue. He barely reacted. As my ride pulled up, I climbed in and didn't bother looking back. The next day, I felt a mix of relief and frustration. Relieved to be done with him, but frustrated that I'd endured such an awful experience after such promising conversations. Then came the final twist. He ghosted me. I couldn't help but laugh when I realized. Of course, he ghosted me. It was the perfect, absurd conclusion to a date so wildly mismatched it felt like a bad rom-com. If nothing else, the ordeal taught me to trust my gut and to stop giving people the benefit of the doubt when red flags started waving. The connection we'd had over text turned out to be a mirage, a facade that crumbled the moment we met in person. And now, it's just another story to tell, one I can laugh at now, even if it made me want to scream at the time. Because if there's one thing dating has taught me, it's this. Sometimes, the most important lesson is knowing when to walk away. The night had started innocently enough. A new city, a new chance at meeting people, and the promise of an evening out at a cool bar. I'd been in town for barely a month, still navigating its streets and quirks, and when the guy I'd matched with suggested we meet in an area I'd heard was trendy, I thought, why not? The area was alive with energy, the hum of indie rock spilling from nearby clubs, mingling with the laughter and chatter of people spilling out of restaurants and bars. It felt like the perfect setting for a fun, low-pressure evening. He greeted me with a grin, his confidence infectious, as we began walking. I let him take the lead, figuring he knew the scene better than I did. That's when we stopped in front of a building with blacked-out windows. I hesitated, glancing at the facade. It was unassuming, almost nondescript, except for the vague neon glow above the entrance. There was no sign, no indication of what lay beyond the door. My curiosity wavered for a second, but then I thought, this must just be part of the charm. Maybe it's one of those hidden cocktail lounges. So I followed him in. The air inside was thick, a strange mix of perfume and leather, with dim red lights casting a glow over the space. My eyes adjusted slowly, but when they did, the reality hit me. Women in barely their outfits moved gracefully across a stage, the music heavy and pulsing. Conversations buzzed quietly in the shadows as patrons leaned back in their seats, drink glasses glinting under the neon light. It was a strip club. I froze for a moment, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to turn around and walk out. This wasn't what I'd signed up for, but something held me there. Maybe it was the unfamiliarity of the situation, or maybe I just didn't want to seem rude. I'd never set foot in a place like this before. Growing up, strip clubs were the kind of thing hidden in seedy corners of town, not in the middle of a bustling, trendy area. My date didn't seem fazed at all. In fact, he was enjoying himself, chatting animatedly, as if this were a totally normal place for a first date. "Want a drink?" he asked casually, his voice barely audible over the music. I nodded, still trying to process the turn the evening had taken. He handed me a drink, and before I could figure out what to say or do next, he leaned closer with a sly grin. "How about a lap dance?" he offered. I blinked, caught off guard. I don't think so." "Come on," he urged. "It'll be fun. My treat." Something in his tone made me agree, more out of awkwardness than genuine interest. A few moments later, he waved over a dancer, her smile warm but slightly tired. She wasn't the youngest or flashiest on the floor, but there was something authentic about her that made me choose her. Her expression brightened when I pointed her out, and I realized I might have just made her night. As she started the dance, I surprised myself by striking up a conversation with her. "So, how long have you been doing this?" I asked, my voice louder than usual to be heard over the music. She laughed, clearly not expecting the question. "A few years," she replied, moving in rhythm with the song. "It's not bad, pays the bills, and I meet some interesting people." We chatted through most of the dance, me asking questions about her job and her life, her answering with surprising candor. It felt oddly normal, like I was catching up with a friend, even though the circumstances were anything but. When my date decided to get his own lap dance, she leaned in before leaving. "Tell him to pick someone who's having a rough night," she whispered, her tone conspiratorial. I passed along the suggestion, and he followed through, choosing another dancer who'd been standing off to the side, looking bored. Her face lit up when he waved her over, and I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. If nothing else, at least 2 women got a little extra money tonight. The rest of the evening was a blur of strange but oddly fascinating moments. I watched as the dancers moved across the stage, their performances blending artistry and raw confidence. My date, meanwhile, grew increasingly comfortable in the space, clearly more at ease than I was. By the end of the night, I felt like I'd stepped into another world and lived to tell the tale. It wasn't the cool indie bar I'd imagined, and it certainly wasn't the kind of date I'd expected, but it was an experience, one that left me equal parts amused and bewildered. As we walked out into the cool night air, I realized that this date wasn't about romance or chemistry. It was about stepping out of my comfort zone and embracing the unexpected. I wasn't sure if I'd ever see this guy again. It didn't really matter. What mattered was that I now had a story to tell, one that I'd never forget. Sometimes the best thing you can do is roll with the punches, even when the night takes a turn you didn't see coming. I'd matched with him online, and after a week or so of light-hearted banter, we decided to meet up. He seemed mostly normal in his photos, and our conversations had been engaging enough. So when he showed up looking like his profile and full of compliments, I thought this might actually turn into something decent. At first, it was easygoing. He complimented me often, his words teetering between flattering and over the top, but I brushed it off. Some people get nervous on first dates, and his enthusiasm seemed genuine, even sweet. His energy was high, maybe a little too high, but I wrote that off as part of his personality. We laughed, talked, and shared stories over drinks. It felt like a good time. By the end of the evening, I decided to invite him back to my place. He seemed like a good guy, and the chemistry between us was undeniable. As soon as we got inside, the atmosphere shifted. The playful banter turned into deeper flirting, and before long, we were making out on my couch. It escalated quickly, his hands were everywhere, and the intensity grew. I had to put the brakes on, and let him know I couldn't have sex that night. He seemed fine with it, or so I thought. Instead, we settled into fooling around, and I ended up giving him a handjob. Everything seemed normal until that moment, the exact moment he finished. His entire demeanor shifted. At first, it was subtle. He went quiet, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by a heavy silence. His face clouded over, and he looked visibly upset. I couldn't understand why. Sure, it hadn't been a drawn-out experience, but it hadn't exactly been 2 seconds either. I waited for him to say something, but the silence stretched on, growing increasingly uncomfortable. Then it got even weirder. He stood abruptly and began pacing around my living room. His movements were erratic, almost frantic, as if he were searching for something. I watched, confused, as he inspected my patio door, flipping the lock back and forth. Then he wandered into the bathroom, opening and closing the cabinets as if they held answers to some unspoken question. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to mask my growing unease. He barely acknowledged me, muttering something under his breath that I couldn't quite catch. I followed him upstairs, where he began wandering through my bedroom, touching the light switches and checking the windows. My townhome was multi-story, and soon I found myself trailing him as he climbed up and down, opening doors and inspecting spaces like a detective searching for clues. I didn't know whether to laugh or be scared. His behavior was relentless, as if he couldn't sit still, and his earlier charm had evaporated entirely. My attempts to engage him, asking what he was doing, offering him water, suggesting we sit back down, were met with vague responses or complete dismissal. Eventually, I reached my limit. The situation had shifted from strange to downright unsettling, and I realized I had to get him out of my house. Gathering my courage, I put on my most polite but firm voice. "Hey, it's getting late, and I'm feeling pretty tired. Maybe we should call it a night." For a moment, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he grabbed his jacket and left. The sound of the door closing behind him was both a relief and a lingering mystery. As I locked the door, I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Everything had gone from normal to bizarre so quickly that my mind struggled to make sense of it. Was it something I'd done? Had he simply been overwhelmed? Or was there something deeper, something I hadn't picked up on earlier in the night? The next day, I replayed the events over and over in my head, trying to find a rational explanation. I even turned to Reddit, sharing the story in hopes of getting some clarity. The responses ranged from lighthearted jokes about my skills to serious suggestions that he might have been struggling with bipolar disorder or some other mental health issue. I never heard from him again, and truthfully, I was relieved. The whole experience left me rattled, a strange mix of embarrassment, confusion, and curiosity. I couldn't help but wonder if this was a one-off incident for him, or if he carried this strange energy into every date. Looking back, I realize how important it is to trust your instincts. That sense of unease I'd felt after his sudden mood shift was my gut telling me something was off, even if I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. It's a lesson I won't forget, one that reminds me to prioritize my comfort and safety above politeness. Now, it's just another story in my dating archive, the kind you tell friends over drinks with a mix of humor and disbelief. Life has a way of throwing unexpected curveballs, and sometimes all you can do is dodge them and laugh about it later.